the basics of exam technique. Now, remember, these are just the fundamentals. We will be elaborating on these much more in the course to come, but this is just to make sure that any big gaps are filled in with your exam technique so that you're not left stranded until you learn those techniques, maybe a month from now. So these are the fundamentals, get used to them and get confident at them, and then later on we will be upgrading and replacing them as part of the system. But there are a few things that you need to make sure you do when you are sitting an exam or the immediate preparation before the exam to ensure you have the optimum performance possible and give yourself the best chance of getting a high result. And one of those things is sleep. So you have to get sufficient sleep before the day of a test or an exam. And the reason is purely because there is something called sleep-dependent memory consolidation, which we talk about later in the course as well. But long story short, it means that you will not be able to use the information you studied until you actually go into a deeper level of sleep where it's taken to higher level cortices, and then you can use that for your test and exam. So it means that all the time you spend learning material may actually be in your brain, locked, unable to be used, which is obviously a huge shame and a waste of time. So if you're gonna cram beforehand. If you're gonna do all-nighters, do them beforehand, but at least the day before your exam or test, make sure that you're getting sufficient sleep, more than enough sleep. Be conservative about it. The additional sleep is going to help you perform better. And also, sleep is also related to your level of cognitive functioning and executive processing, which includes problem solving. So if you're sleep deprived, you can get up to a 10 to 20 point IQ drop due to sleep deprivation. So the last thing you want when you're walking into an exam is to not only be unable to use the information that you studied, but also to be literally dumber and less able to solve problems or answer the questions in the exam. So sleep is one really major one. And another thing that is very common and a lot of students will ask about is the idea of double checking and the system behind, should I check the answer? Should I change my answer? What should I do? So there's a few different schools of thought around this, and some of the older research and a lot of the common understanding of it was that you shouldn't change your answer if you were to double check it. So it was against double checking. However, some more recent research that's coming out suggests that actually that may not be so true, and that double checking can actually make you change to a better answer. The system that I use, and the one that I generally recommend for most students, is to do what I call priority checking, which is very simple. It just means when you're answering the question, try to go at a pace where you have a little bit of time left over at the end of your test or exam to go through and check some of your questions, but keep your pace relatively consistent. So for example, if you have 10 questions and you're spending 1 minute per question, then don't spend 5 minutes on one question, because if within that first minute you weren't able to figure out what the right answer is, there's a chance that you could just be tunneling in further and further, and it's actually getting more and more confusing for you, and you might exit the exam and 20 minutes later think, oh man, the answer was so obvious, when you bring yourself out of that tunnel vision. And that's a very dangerous place to be in. And I think we all know what that tunnel vision actually feels like. So the system that I use, and that's is one that I've developed throughout the many thousands of questions that I've answered through the many exams that I've had over the years, is to keep a pace that allows me to get through each question comfortably, being relatively sure about the answer for each question. But at the end of the exam, I still have time left to go back and revise the question that I didn't feel so confident on. And the ones that I didn't feel so confident on are the ones that I needed to spend longer on. So let's say if I'm trying to do one question every 30 seconds and there's a certain question that I've already spent a minute on, I'm going to give my best possible answer. I'm going to leave a little star or something next to it. And then at the end, I'll come back to see if I'm able to answer it. And often just taking that time away from the question and coming back to it at the end just opens up your mind a little bit more. And when you look at it again, you think, oh, actually, I'm able to think about this a little bit differently. There may have been a question 20 questions later that allows you to understand that first question a little bit more easily. And so overall, maintaining pace means you're likely to cover all the questions properly, but because you are keeping a list of priorities of which questions that you want to come back to when you do get the chance, you're giving yourself the chance to change the answer for some of those that you did feel weak on without wasting too much time and increasing the risk of changing correct answers into incorrect ones. Because if you felt pretty certain the first time you answered it, chances are that when you look at it, you're going to be changing to a wrong one after that. So we use a little bit of a combination, and I just call this priority checking. Maybe it's already got a different name for it, and if you do, you can let me know, but this is a system that tends to work pretty well. And then the third thing that we can do for exam execution is just in the immediate preparation before the exam is trying to get inside the mind of the examiner and try to prepare for your exam in the way that you think the examiner would test you. And so this is quite different from doing just practice questions. When you do practice questions, you rely on questions that already exist to help you answer different types of content. When I say think like an examiner, what I want you to do is take the information that you know, and I want you to think, if I were to make a really challenging exam or assessment, if I wanted to throw some curveballs to these students, how would I do that? And what that will actually do, it may feel like a subtle change, but it puts your mind in the perspective of someone who is using the information in a way that you know you may not be applying that information. So you may know that you're really good at answering questions that are like A, B, or C. But because you're deliberately looking for the way that they might test you, that you don't know about, you will open yourself to thinking about type number D. And that could be the type of question that they throw as a curveball. And it's an excellent revision strategy to use. Even when you learn the advanced strategies later on, you should still keep doing this. Put yourself in the mind of an examiner. Think, how can I really challenge my knowledge? How would I really trick students out by using this information? Create some questions for yourself. Maybe create questions for if you've got a study group between your friends. Make maybe a list of 40 or 50 different questions about a specific subject and give them to your friends and swap them. And use that as a way of challenging your learning. You'll actually find that not only can it be more effective than past papers, yes, it can actually be more effective than past papers, but also trains your brain to think about the information from the instructor's point of view, which makes it easier to study in the future because you're starting to think about information from multiple different angles, and it makes it easier to understand some of the more difficult concepts. And it's also a technique that you can use through university. A lot of university papers, you don't have access to that many past paper questions, or they change their style of questioning very often. And so relying on past papers is actually not a good idea for a lot of university papers. Not all, but a lot of them. And so being able to do this very comfortably because you've practiced it throughout high school is going to be a really great weapon in your arsenal that you can carry in through university. So that was number 3. And then number 4 is actually just a very simple technique that we can use in an exam. I was always the type of student that got really nervous in an exam, and I would feel myself tunneling in a lot. I hyped it up too much for myself in my mind. And one thing that you can actually do in this situation is simply take long, slow, deep breaths. And this may sound very hippie and not what you're expecting, but there's actually a very physiological reason why this works. And the reason is because there is a nerve that's connected to your diaphragm, which is a muscle that's used to help you breathe. When you take a slow, deep breath, it actually forces your diaphragm to contract, which activates a certain nerve that's connected to it. And that nerve directly invokes what's called the parasympathetic response. And the parasympathetic response is otherwise known as the rest and digest system. It's the opposite of the sympathetic response, which is the fight or flight. So when you're feeling anxious, what's normally happening is that your brain is sensing danger, and that danger is in the form of an exam. Not like some kind of predatory lion or something in the bushes, but it's in the form of an exam, and your brain is sensing real danger, even though there isn't real danger. Well, I mean, I guess you could argue that point, but there isn't something that's life-threatening. Well, I guess you could argue that point as well. But anyway, it's not a lion, it's not going to kill you. So your brain is sensing this danger, and now from your point of view, you need to calm your brain down, and it's very hard to do it because it's a biological response that's activating the sympathetic fight or flight response. Deep breaths forcibly deactivate the fight or flight response, and in fact, if you're feeling really anxious, when you take slow deep breaths, it's almost impossible not to calm down. Now, when you stop taking deep breaths, you may actually end up working yourself up again. But it stops you from going into that spiral. It gives you a bit of, well, breathing room to just relax a little bit, get a bit more comfortable with the environment, get a bit more comfortable with where you're sitting, look around you, get out of your own headspace a little bit, and it gives you the mental freedom to just relax a little bit and open your mind, because that also is going to allow you to be more creative and a better problem solver, because your brain is less tunneled in. You're actually going to perform better in the exam. Like I said before, when you leave an exam and you think, man, I knew the answer to that, why couldn't I think of that? A lot of that is due to the fact that you are in this tunnel vision, and that can be driven by anxiety. I know that for myself it was, and it was really a big problem for me while I was going through high school. I only really got a handle on it while I was in my mid to later years of university, and even still it will affect me. And this is a technique that I consistently will still use, and you can actually use this for any time you're feeling anxious, but in the context of an exam, obviously very, very relevant. So have a little bit of a breathing routine, maybe 10 seconds of very slow, deep breathing, especially the exhale going out really, really slowly, really, really deep. And if you feel yourself trying to breathe a little bit faster, you just force it down. You force your breathing to a slow until you feel yourself calming down a little bit more. You give yourself that little bit of mental space. You sit back a little bit, and then you can re-engage with the task at hand at maximum focus with a calm, clear, and confident mind, so you can get the results that you worked so hard and deserve. When you're in class, to maximize your focus and concentration and engagement, and even your level of enjoyment. What we want out of class is to feel like we got a lot of really good learning done. We don't want to feel like we're just more confused about what's going on. We want to have a pretty good understanding of this topic. Now, remember, these are just fundamental techniques, and so we will be, especially these sets of techniques, we'll be significantly upgrading and replacing them in the system later to come. But if these are new to you, then please get used to them, apply them, practice them. They will give you an immediate benefit, but the idea with these fundamentals is it just gets you used to experimenting a little bit. It gives you some immediate, tangible tips that you can use for your studying straight away. There's almost no real learning curve to any of these techniques, and they will give you an immediate form of benefit. Now, it may not be the level of benefit that we want to achieve by the end of this, but it will be a benefit nonetheless, and you're not going to have to wait, let's say, 3 to 4 weeks until you learn the upgraded version of the technique, and in the meantime you're falling asleep in class. Obviously we don't want that. So few things that we can talk about when it comes to in-class technique. Now, one of the things that people generally underestimate is the power of pre-study and learning a little bit of the material beforehand. And I'm not talking about getting a full understanding of the entire topic before you sit in class so that you're not even needing to listen to what the teacher says or the lecturer says if you're at university. What I'm talking about is simply getting a familiarization with a few basic elements of the topic so we know how to think about this. And so the in-class performance is actually really significantly impacted by how familiar you are with the content. So for example, if I put you in a fourth year university lecture, you are probably not going to be able to follow along very well unless you're in fourth year or above university. However, if I put you in a year 8 class, even if you technically forgot what you learned in year 8, it's going to be very easy for you to pick up on it because you have so much other knowledge that's related to it. So when you learn something new, it's like, oh, that's kind of obvious because you can relate it to so many other things. This is an idea that we're actually going to talk about and elaborate on a lot more coming up. But one of the first things that you can do is train yourself to do a topic level pre-study where you take the entire topic of what you might be learning for the next, maybe few weeks even, and you just try to isolate what are the 3 or 4 main ideas. And they may be the same as what your teacher tells you, they may be the same as what's in a study guide or whatever other resource you have available. It doesn't really matter. Or you may find that actually there's another way of grouping it together. There may be 7 main concepts that you find in your resources. But when you really think about it, you might think, you know what? This one and this one are kind of the same sort of thing. It's sort of talking about the same thing. And you can start grouping it together. So I challenge you to find just 3 or 4 main ideas. And working with students from the range of curriculums within not only Australia and New Zealand, but also within university levels and IB, which is obviously international, multiple other countries, I've never really found a situation where the topic couldn't be broken up into roughly 3 or 4 main concepts or groups of concepts and basic ideas. So that's what you need to do in the pre-study. You're not aiming to read and learn absolutely everything about everything. You don't need to memorize anything really. All you're doing is you're just kind of going through the material enough and just thinking like, okay, what is the main idea here? So for, let's say, 3 weeks of class material, which is an entire topic, let's say, that whole topic might take you, a dozen hours to study. Normally, doing it this way, you might only spend 30 minutes to 1 hour. So you'd spend 30 minutes to 1 hour just reading through all the different, class material or the lecture material or whatever it is in there in the topic. And then by the end of that, you're able to say, okay, so this is a topic that really talks about these 3 or 4 main ideas. And then on top of that, you want to think about how do those ideas kind of relate to each other? What's the relationship between there? You're forming a basic backbone. You want to say, all right, this is a topic which talks about this idea of A and how without it, you really can't get B. But then because of it, you get C occurring and then D happens. So a few ideas and the relationship or flow of ideas between those basic groups of concepts or concepts. And the reason this is so beneficial is because it primes your brain. And priming is a proper terminology to use here in that it gives your brain a way of thinking about this to help it make sense of what you learn in class. So when you learn something in class, now there's an anchor point that it can attach to. You can think, oh, this is new information, but I can see how it is kind of related to this. It gives the information a place to belong, and when we learn more about the learning psychology, we see how that can drastically change that slope of the forgetting curve that we talked about before, and it can increase your retention by a lot. So it's an incredibly powerful technique that you can use. It's very easy to do. You don't have to stress too much about it. Like I said, just 30 minutes to an hour going through an entire topic's worth of content, just figuring out the main ideas and groups of ideas and how they're related to each other, and then take that knowledge with you into your class, and you will find that the class starts to make a little bit more sense. And hopefully you start having a few more questions about what the teacher is saying, which is a sign that you are activating more innate curiosity-driven learning processes, which are actually, from a neuropsychology point of view, more effective and increase your retention compared to other things that are not curiosity-driven, like rote learning. So that was the first thing, which is just doing a little bit of basic pre-reading or priming for the 3 to 4 main ideas and the relationships between them. The second thing that we can do, now this is truly when you're sitting there in class, is always make sure to paraphrase what's being said. Now, a little bit of a disclaimer here, this particular technique about paraphrasing, we're actually very quickly going to start upgrading that because there's a lot of stages that we can upgrade this towards, and it gets more and more efficient as time goes on. But in the early stages, if you're not already, and I know a lot of you will be, but if you're not already, make sure that you're not just copying verbatim. So there is research that says that people that copy verbatim, and verbatim means word for word, they have a lower level of retention, and their test results and exam results are actually worse. And this is another reason why typing your notes is actually not very effective, because typing makes it so easy to get information down because it's so much faster than writing that it stops you from needing to filter out what you're going to write down and what you're not. And as a result, your notes end up being more word for word. And so the closer it is to being word for word, the lower the level of retention. And this is actually what's called passive learning. And you may have heard of the difference between passive versus active learning. Passive learning means that your brain is not really switched on. And so even though you are taking notes, there's not really any learning going on in here. It's just like a mindless activity, like kind of if you're like washing dishes and you're not really paying attention, you're just kind of doing the action. That's sort of what's going on, is that you're sitting there, you're listening and you're writing stuff down, but there's no real learning going on in your head. And yes, you can go and take that information and learn it properly afterwards, if you don't have much content to study, or if you have a lot of time available for you during the week, then that's fine. But what you'll find, and what the university students out there will know, is that that's not really possible at a university level, especially for more difficult content, or even if you are doing a difficult type of curriculum in high school or a difficult subject, information is usually thrown at you quite quickly. You've got a lot of stuff to study, and if you need to then spend time afterwards to study it again to actually understand and gain proper learning from that, that is a lot of time wasted, which you're not going to be able to afford. And even if you can afford it, I would personally rather spend that time, socializing or playing games or picking up new hobbies or just sleeping more, or like saying hi to my mum or something like that. There's better ways to use that time. And so you don't want your words to be verbatim. You want to make sure you're always paraphrasing, and if possible, paraphrase to the simplest and most concise form as is possible for you. And you should feel mentally there's a bit of a challenge here. And that's a good sign. You should feel that, man, this is requiring quite a lot of concentration for me to take this information in and really condense it down and really quickly make notes of it. If you feel that, that's actually a good sign, because it means that the time spent in class is contributing towards increasing your attention. And it's also a foundation skill that you need to develop. Otherwise, you're really going to struggle with a lot of the more efficient techniques out there when it comes to note taking, because word for word note taking caps off in efficiency very, very early. Okay, so we've covered number one, the idea of pre-study in that very specific way, topic-wide, not lesson-wide. And then number two, the idea of being much more active and engaged with your learning through extreme paraphrasing as much as possible and not typing your notes. And again, there's going to be study gurus that are out there that say that's not the case, but you know what? They probably can't justify their recommendation. They probably will just say, oh, it's much faster for me to type than it is to write. Well, I'm telling you, it's much faster for you to learn by not typing than it is to type and get notes down without having actually learned anything. And not only is there research on this, but you ask any of the students in our community, they will know what we're talking about, because they will have felt the difference that it makes when you have an effective freehand note-taking strategy. And on that note, we move on to point number three, is try to represent some ideas or relationships between ideas with arrows and spatial arrangement. So the thing is that you can actually represent a lot of information without having to write it. So I want you to imagine something like this. A leads to B, and then B leads to C and D. So we have A and B leading to C and D. If we were to represent that in a mind map or a flow chart or using arrows and spatial arrangement, we would say, okay, A is a pretty big topic. I'm going to put it right here. B is a pretty big topic. I'm going to put it right here. C is a little mini piece. I can put it right in the middle, and I can put D directly underneath it. And when you look at the page, you're going to see A, B, little c, and then D. And you'll see the flow of information going down the page. That actually gives you a lot of information, and it uses a different part of your brain which is involved in spatial arrangement of things. This is why sometimes you can remember where on your notes information is, but you don't actually remember what it is in itself. Or you remember generally the position of items in your room or something, but you don't actually remember exactly where it is. Your brain's ability to process information in space on the page, the position of things on the page, actually provides it with a lot more cues that allow it to record that information much more easily and increases your retention. Now, when we add arrows into the mix, it makes it even easier. Because let's say the relationship between A to B and then C to D, in words, we would have to say, A is a process that allows B to occur, which leads to C, and once C is occurred, D is able to occur. That's quite a long list of things, and when you write it, the only way that you can really process that information is to read it from start to finish. You can't really look at an entire paragraph and just instantaneously take that information in. Visual processing is tens of thousands of times faster than your ability to process written words. So if you have A arrow B arrow C plus D, that communicates the relationship almost exactly the same way. And you're not really losing any detail there, nothing that was actually really meaningful at all. But your ability to take that in and also to revise it is much faster, because when you look at your notes, you will be able to process, take that information in, and work with it literally tens of thousands of times faster than if you were to read things. This is actually something that we already know. For example, if you've ever read Lord of the Rings, J.R.R. Tolkien spends like an entire page describing a single door. When you watch Lord of the Rings, the movie, you just see the door and you think that's quite a fancy door. And you know about the door and the characteristics of the door and the lighting and all of that sort of stuff. The picture speaks 1,000 words. Actually, the picture speaks like 10,000 words. And if you're writing 10,000 words with something that can be represented with arrows and spatial arrangement to form kind of a picture type understanding, you are going to be able to study that much faster. And again, this is something that students often find very difficult when they enter into university, because you're so used to writing everything out. So it's a good thing to start breaking away from this early on. It's very easy to do. Take it to a level that you're comfortable with. I'm not saying replace everything that you're writing with these crazy diagrams or anything like that. All I'm saying is that when you see there's a certain relationship, instead of writing it as a paragraph or a list, think, can I express this through some arrows or a mini mind map? Is there another way that I can represent this information that will make it a bit visually clearer for me to see and make kind of a bit of a story or a flow or an image out of it? And always think about that and start getting used to that. And the earlier you practice this, the easier it will be to transition into some of the high power, high efficiency techniques that we're going to teach later on. So far we've got pre-study, we've got the idea of active learning through paraphrasing, and also now not only just paraphrasing, but introducing the idea of this visual element, arrows and spatial arrangement as well. Now again, you don't have to be perfect at this. What I want you to do is give it a go. I want you to experiment with it. I want you to try, feel it out. Don't worry if you feel like it's not giving you the perfect result. The most important thing is that you give it a go, you see how you find it, and if there's something that you think you can do to improve, give that a go as well. It's a very low risk thing that we're trying to do here. You're not going to fail a paper by doing this. You're not even going to impact your exam result negatively by doing this. We're simply getting you to just taste a little bit of these different things, and if it works for you, great, keep going, and if it doesn't, think about why. Experiment a little bit, and then after that you can ask us why. You can say, we've tried this and it doesn't work, what would you suggest? And then eventually, as you move through the course, you will actually again upgrade all of these skills. Everything that I talk about in these foundations, we will upgrade all of that eventually anyway. So for now, just get your feet wet, just get a little bit into it, just start experimenting a little bit and start building a bit of that basic competence. And the final thing that I want to add on here is the idea of listening first. So this kind of is a bit implicit. So if you're paying attention to the previous stuff, it's kind of impossible to paraphrase information without having listened to it first. And I know it's tempting, especially in a fast-paced lecture or a class, to be constantly writing things down or to be typing things as the person is speaking to you. But this is actually really disadvantageous for your learning, because not only is it not activating your brain, so it means that you're spending time sitting there listening to this person and you're not even learning from it. All you're doing is just you're like a human photocopier, like a transcribing machine, and you're not getting the learning that you could be getting out of it. So it's time wasted, but it also is not training your brain to be able to learn through that auditory type of learning. And remember what we talked about before, training yourself to learn through different modes is extremely beneficial. So if you know that you struggle to listen and really learn through listening, training yourself to do that is going to be enormous benefit to you for later in life. I mean, imagine if you could learn extremely effectively, whether it's spoken, whether it's experienced, whether it's read, whether it's seen or visualized. All of these methods, they are under your domain. Your ability to work with and manipulate information and turn it into something that you can really use and get those top marks in tests and exams is so much higher than someone who's very fixed and only is able to work in a certain way. And again, the research is very clear. Unless there's some kind of medical abnormality with your brain, and this is not a meme, so it's probably not going to be you, but actually even with learning disabilities like ADHD or dyslexia, it's actually still the case that you can learn through all these different modes, and you are able to train yourself to learn through these different modes. So it's definitely a worthwhile investment. So 4 things that we covered: the pre-study, the paraphrasing, the arrows and the spatial arrangement, and the listening first before you write. And again, most importantly, don't worry about getting it perfect. The idea is to just give it a go, get a taste for it, experiment with a little bit. Once you're comfortable, start experimenting a little bit more, getting a bit more comfortable, so that later on when we teach you other techniques that are more advanced, then it will be a lot easier to use those techniques and incorporate them and upgrade your system even more efficiently. Now, and note-taking is another one of those techniques, much like our in-class techniques, that you will be upgrading significantly throughout the course. But what we're teaching right now, again, are just the fundamentals. We will work on them. Just experiment a little bit, get a little bit comfortable with them, start experimenting and get a bit of experience under your belt about using these different types of techniques. And that's going to allow your transition through the other techniques much smoother. There may be a lot of things that you already know and are already applying right now, and that's great. Props to you. If it is new, make sure you do apply it. Make sure that you practice it. Remember, it is a skill. You're not going to learn it instantaneously. You do need to put a little bit of time on it. And I would expect that it's normal for, if there's a lot of new things that you're learning in this mini course, that you would spend a period of days or even weeks here before you move on to the full course. Don't rush. If you're feeling that there is a benefit, if you feel like there's more practice needed to develop the skill, spend some time to develop that skill. It's going to be worth it in the long run. Anyway, after all, you're here to improve the way that you're studying. If what it takes is a bit more time to improve your studying, then you're winning. There's a lot of similarities in terms of what I'm going to be talking about in this mini lesson compared to the lesson about in-class techniques, because a lot of the ways that I talked about writing notes in class also apply to just writing notes in general. And the main point that I want to get across is that you shouldn't try to express all of your information in just words. And when I say just words, I'm really talking about bullet points and lists and paragraphs and writing as if you're kind of typing. And the reason this is not good is because, well, there's actually a lot of reasons. First of all, it doesn't force you to use or manipulate the knowledge in any way outside of the original way that you may have learned it. We're really used to reading things from books, textbooks, course guides, whatever it is. And when we write it in exactly the same way, it doesn't activate another part of our brain, and it doesn't involve other types of learning processes that can actually allow us to hold on to the information for longer and therefore adjust the slope of that forgetting curve so that we can not have to revise so often, or when we do revise, we're just forgetting less. So we want to be using different aspects of the brain, and I'm going to reiterate what I talked about in the in-class techniques section. So if you haven't watched that yet, I would actually recommend pause, stop this video, go and watch that first, and then come back to this, because I'm not going to be explaining it in duplicate. And the point that I'm making here is the idea of using spatial arrangement and arrows where you can. So you may have certain notes that you've made in class. You may have even made a few little notes in the pre-study just as a basic framework that you're adding to in class or something like that. Whatever it is, take those notes, look at it and think, is there a way that I can express this that's not using just words and lists and bullet points and things? Can I express it with some kind of imagery? Or can I express this with some kind of arrow or symbol or something like that? Start getting a little bit more visual in the way that you're learning. And this is something that I will be talking about again very soon, actually, in the course, and I'll continue to be building on this, but I want you to just start experimenting a little bit. And it's actually very easy. All you need to do is look for areas where there are big chunks of text. And anywhere there are big chunks of text, usually there's a way to express that information in some kind of flow of ideas with arrows and spatial arrangement. Or instead of necessarily writing the word for something, maybe you can draw a little image for it instead. And that can represent it. So instead of, for example, if you want to make notes about a different type of plant, then instead of writing the word plant, maybe you can actually just draw a leaf or something and color it green. Little things like that actually can make up a lot of those marginal gains. And it not only makes it cleaner and easier to see, but again, it's activating different parts of your brain, which increases your ability to retain and process that information. And it's also a fundamental skill that we're going to be building on later on. Now, a lot of people will say, well, I don't learn that way, or it's not really for me, but it's just not true. The human brain, again, is capable of learning in basically every way that we want it to. It's just a matter of whether we're used to it and whether we have kind of trained ourselves to do that. And it's, again, worth training yourself to, and not even hard when you start with these little baby steps. I'm not going to say exactly what you need to turn from words into non-words or how to exactly reduce the words, because I want you to examine the work yourself. I want you to look at it and start developing an eye so you can train yourself into thinking, oh, I'm recognizing that there are certain things that I tend to write down that I don't need to write down. And we can change those things and express them a different way. So start small, start with whatever you're comfortable with turning into something that's not just paragraphs or words or lists. And then as you get more and more comfortable, you can start changing it more and more. But for now, just start with baby steps. Just start building a little bit of that momentum and see what you're able to do straight off the bat. I can guarantee that you can look at your notes and you can look at some aspect of any note for any topic, and you can think, there is another way that I can express this that doesn't rely on me having written out paragraphs or lists, and play with that a little bit. As a little bit of a rule of thumb, generally, things that are conceptual, you can actually represent that more easily with arrows and spatial arrangement, and maybe even diagrams or images or little doodles even that just kind of make you think about a certain thing. Whereas pure facts, they generally do rely more on having words because it's a bit more specific information. So concepts which tend to be a little bit bigger picture can be expressed without words more often, whereas details and facts, often you will need words, at least until you start learning some of the more advanced memorization techniques that don't rely on that anymore. Of different techniques that you should be using when you're writing your notes and how you think about the information when you're learning it. And this is a little bit weird if you think about it, but a lot of people don't actually think about what they're doing with information that they hear or see. They'll often read, and that's where the buck stops. You read and that's it. You listen and that's it. There isn't really a conscious process of doing something with that information. And the thing with the brain is that it works a lot better when you give it more of a focus and more of a direction. Yes, you can sit there and just read and listen, and your brain will figure some things out and learn and piece it together and end up organizing it in different places in your mental room, just because your brain is a really powerful learning machine. But it's a lot less effective than actually if you give it clear direction and clear focus and give it a certain intention so that you can actually take that information and enhance the learning process that's going on inside our head. Because remember, the studying that we're doing out here, the notes that we're writing, the books that we're reading, and the lectures or classes that we're listening to, that's all of the stuff that we're trying to do in order to actually get the knowledge up in here. It doesn't matter how many notes you're writing. It doesn't matter how many books you've read. If you don't have the knowledge in your brain, you didn't do any real learning. And so because of the fact that we want to learn, not just do mindless study, we need to be in control of what goes on in our brain, and the way that we write our notes can actually facilitate that. So one of the first things that I would recommend for a very beginner who's just trying to deviate away from normal conventional note writing is to actually just simply split your page in half and have a collecting step and a processing step. So what we're doing here is we're saying, I understand there's a difference between taking down information and then organizing that information and making it my own. If you imagine something that you have learned a long time ago that you know really well, it's kind of like your basic knowledge now, but maybe a 10-year-old wouldn't know this, then when you teach it to someone else, you're probably going to teach it in a slightly different way to how your friend might teach it.
And that's not because you're right and they're wrong. It's just that the way you see it might be slightly different because you've made the knowledge your own. And you want to do that for everything that you learn. You want to make the knowledge your own. So when we divide the page in two, we can say when we're in class, we're simply writing down the notes as we normally would. We're writing it down, we're taking the information in, and all of that sort of thing. And so this is pretty messy, it's chaotic, it's not organized. You don't want to be writing too much because it's just very time consuming to physically write so much. So you want to minimize that, use a bit more keywords. There are a lot of words like the, and, leads to, in addition, things like that that we end up writing that we don't need. We can use symbols like arrows or plus signs or, some kind of arrow that indicates that one thing leads to another. So we can use a lot of these symbols to cut down on a lot of the words that we're writing. We want to collect that information first. What we want to do while we're collecting is every time the concept is changing, this might be at the end of every paragraph, after your teacher's finished speaking to you, when you feel like, oh, we've kind of covered that subtopic and we're ready to move on, you want to have a look at everything that you've written down on the collecting stage, and then you want to try to process it into something that makes a little bit more sense for you. So this is kind of like paraphrasing, but the difference between paraphrasing and this processing step is that paraphrasing simply means rewriting it in your own words. So you'd potentially, if we were paraphrasing, we would take this paragraph and we'd rewrite it in a simpler sentence that's kind of saying the same thing, but just redone in our own words. Now, that's good, but we actually want to take it a little bit further because we can. So instead of doing it this way, we want to actually think about the simplest way that we can represent as much information as possible. And this is the key difference between paraphrasing and the processing step. We want to represent as much as possible in the simplest way. So when we look at this, we might think that, hey, actually, this whole set of ideas is kind of talking about the same thing. And I feel like I could represent that by having a drawing here leading to another drawing here, and then 2 or 3 sentences underneath that to really highlight the important parts. So by doing this, you can actually focus purely on representing the ideas super cleanly and simply on this side without having to worry about missing any detail because you've already got all the detail on this side anyway, and it's always there for your reference. But what we want to do is train our brain to be able to simplify as much information as possible and organize it. Because if we simplify it, there's less that our brain needs to hold on to, and therefore it's easier for it to be retained. And a lot of other complex psychology, which later in the course you're going to learn about. But this is also a very fundamental skill because this ability to process information is critical to using an entire swarm of other note-taking strategies that are vastly more effective even than this. It will save you a ton of time. So you really want to be able to train your brain to think in this way where there's a difference between just taking information in and then actually processing and doing something with it. So this is a great beginner tool for just training that initial ability and just getting that foundation right. But wait, there's more. We can actually take this technique and make it even better and make it faster for us to be able to do the processing. And the way that we can do this is by activating a specific type of mindset that our brain is hardwired to perform really efficiently under. And that is the problem-solving mindset. So remember how I said that the brain works better when you give it a focus? Well, one of the best focuses for the brain to have is to solve a problem. This is why you end up learning a lot when you're doing past paper questions, because the information that you're trying to consolidate is for the purpose of answering a question. The information has a purpose, and because there's a purpose, your brain knows what to do with the information. And so when we give the brain a problem to solve, any information that we take in is viewed through the lens of, how does this help me solve the problem? It's kind of like if I said that I need you to fix a hole in the wall. And that's your problem. You're thinking, how do I fix the hole in the wall? And I give you a bunch of tools and a bunch of materials. And you'd look at the tool and you'd think, is this going to help me fix the hole in the wall. And by doing that, you would actually examine each tool and each material to see if it helps you fix the hole in the wall. And so you'd actually end up learning a lot about each tool and each material because you're thinking about all the information in the context of a problem. And your brain works really well that way. So what we can do in our pre-study is spend a little bit of time to create a list of basic questions that we can ask ourselves that might give a bit more purpose to the material. So if you know that the class that's coming up is about electricity or waves in physics, or if we are learning about human evolution, or if we're learning about human physiology or something, then we can ask a series of big questions, and these don't have to even be relevant to your exams or anything. It's just to get your brain thinking about it in terms of solving a problem. We can just ask it a few questions that will make us wonder, why is this important? And we're going to be coming back to this question again, and it's going to mean a whole lot more the next time that we learn about it. But we want to start asking these questions. Why is this important? How can I use this or apply? And if we have just a few questions that we create beforehand, then that means that number one, we're more likely to be curious about the information as we learn it. We're more likely to ask further questions as we learn more. And as a result, because we're looking at how we can use this information for different purposes, it's easier to actually process it and make it make sense inside our own brains. So a lot of students will spend most of their studying time simply trying to absorb information like some kind of sponge. But our brain does not work that way. Our brain is not a sponge. Our brain is much better at working when it's trying to apply the information for a purpose. So when you're trying to learn anything new, or even if you're revising something that you feel like you're shaky on and you didn't learn it properly the first time, you want to think about how you can apply it as early as possible. You don't want to wait 1 or 2 months until you start doing practice papers. You want to just get that applying the information as soon as is possible. Preferably at the moment you learn it, you want to think, how can I use this information? Or at the very least, at the end of every week when you're going through, you can think, how can I use this information? And when we ask ourselves those questions, even before we've learned it, during our pre-study, it means that the entire week is spent learning stuff where we're curious about it, trying to see how we can apply it, and therefore our retention increases by a lot. And this basic structure is something that we're going to come back to again and again and again, and you're going to realize how powerful it can be when we take this basic skill that you can develop from this very simple technique and then apply it to some more advanced techniques later on. And the most important thing you have to realize here, the most important, is that it doesn't matter if you're doing the questions the right way or the wrong way. It doesn't matter if you processed it the right way or the wrong way. There is no right or wrong way to do these basic skills, because what we're trying to do is get you some more experience at using techniques like this that are deviating away and learn a little bit more about how your brain works. We want to learn what doesn't work as much as we want to learn about what does work. So just go for it. Ask a few questions. If it helped you process the information and understand a little bit better, great. If it didn't, try asking slightly different questions. And we just keep doing that until we find something that works. And that means that later on, when I teach you more techniques that build on these skills, you already have a good foundation to build off of, rather than trying to teach you even more theories that you're going to play around with in your head and ultimately end up with one mediocre looking photo. So remember, the best way to do this is to just start doing it and actually get some real practice under your belt. Don't worry about getting it wrong. The only way you can get this wrong is by not doing it.
scheduling. And when I say study scheduling, I'm talking about big picture over the days, weeks, and months. When do you revise the material? When do you study so that you can get the best marks possible? Again, as with all the lessons here, they are just fundamentals and we will be upgrading them significantly later in the course. So for now, the most important thing you can do is build a little bit of momentum, get your hands dirty, and start experimenting with some of these very basic techniques. Get comfortable with using these, and that will allow you to transition into the more advanced techniques much more easily. The worst thing that you can do is just twiddle your thumbs, sit on your hands, and not apply any of these techniques because either you're lazy or you don't feel like you've got enough time. None of these techniques are very difficult to use. They are all things that you can start using straight away. They are all techniques that have a pretty immediate benefit, even if it is, in some of these cases, a small benefit. They're things that will allow you to start stacking up those marginal gains and improvements. So make sure that you get a little bit of experience and your hands dirty with experimenting on this. So we're talking about study scheduling, and there are some very basic rules that we should be following, which is the first being the 1 day, 1 week, 1 month rule. And that is saying that it's very simplistic form of expanding gap spaced repetition. When you learn something, let's say that you learn it on a Monday, try to revise it again on the Tuesday, roughly a day later, maybe the Wednesday, but I would generally not leave it any further than that. And then revise it again around a week later. So if you learned it on the Monday, you might learn it on the Friday. If you learn it on the Thursday, Friday is only a day later, maybe you'll learn it the next Friday. So you don't have to get it down exactly, but as long as we're generally following the principle that the first revision happens within the first day or two, and the second revision happens round about 7 to 10 days after the first one, and the second one happens around about 3 or 4 weeks after the second one. That ends up being a good general timing that you can use. Now, there are flaws in the system. Again, it is just a very basic strategy. It's not going to work all the time. It's going to be excessive sometimes for some subjects, and it's not going to be enough for other subjects. And that's where some of the more advanced techniques are going to come in. But this is a really good foundation to start off. And actually, this foundation is what I used for really the first 2 to 3 years of university. I didn't outgrow it up until that point, and I was studying some serious content at the time. So I would suggest that for most people, this is going to work reasonably well. And if you do have problems, we will solve them later in the course anyway. So all you have to do is just get your diary, or if you're using an app, just set aside a half a day at the end of every week as your weekly, and then set aside another day or half day or a couple days, depending on how much you need to study, at the end of every month. And keep that as repeating. So every, let's say for example, Friday, or let's say that your weekly revision is done on a Saturday. So every Saturday, you are revising what you learned for that week. And then every final Saturday and Sunday, you're revising everything you learned for the entire month. Now, again, it doesn't have to be an exact science. You don't have to time exactly when you're getting everything. As long as you're generally following these principles, it's going to be fine. And the most important thing here is actually not the whole 1 day, 1 week, 1 month thing. It's the actually scheduling it into your day so that you know that at a certain time, this is what you need to do, and keeping yourself accountable. There are a lot of students that we teach some of the more advanced scheduling tips to, and then they start school and it just goes out the window. They just don't use any of those things anymore, even though they know that using it is going to make their life easier. And then they start using it and then they think, wow, a lot of my problems have just been solved. There is a force of habit of how you schedule your time and use your time that we need to overcome. And the first step of that is keeping yourself accountable, having a diary, literally write it in your diary, have it on your schedule, and just keep yourself accountable. Keep your friends accountable, and just follow these basic tips. The other thing is something that I've already talked about when it comes to the in-class techniques, which again, if you haven't watched that, make sure to go watch that and then come back to this, is the idea of doing pre-reading. So pre-study, so learning an entire topic before you learn it in class or learn it in lectures is extremely beneficial. And because it makes it easier for you to learn during the class itself, It's good because it actually saves you time later. So let's say that you spend 1 hour or even 2 hours studying an entire topic at a very basic level before the class or the lectures begin. That means that during class and lectures, you're more focused, you're more attentive, it makes more sense, it's more relevant, your attention is higher, which means that you now need to spend much less time revising it later to catch up on all of this stuff. So you will easily save that amount of time through your revision, through not having to relearn or spend additional time or forgetting things that you studied once and then 2 weeks later you completely forgot about. So I usually say that an hour of pre-study saves 10 hours later down the line between learning it and your test or exam. And I've always found this to be generally true, and sometimes even more than 10 hours is saved. You never want to be so busy that you deprioritize pre-studying. You always want to make sure that you're on top of your pre-study game. So again, set this in your schedule. Maybe every Monday morning, maybe every Sunday evening, maybe every Saturday, you're going to spend some time to pre-study the material to come. And that's going to make your week a lot easier, and you're going to save so much time in the revision by doing that. So this is the hottest of hot tips, is make sure that you schedule time for pre-study. And again, it doesn't really matter. You could do it on a Tuesday if you wanted to, as long as you're scheduling time and you keep it consistent and you're getting it done. And then the final thing is the idea of the snowball effect with learning. And so we want to always leverage the snowball effect. And this actually ties into the idea of pre-study as well. When we combine pre-study techniques and in-class techniques and note-taking techniques and study scheduling, 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, when we put all of that together, we get the snowball effect. And the snowball effect is one of the most powerful things in learning that you want to capitalize on. It simply says that the more you know about something, the easier it is to learn about that. And again, it makes sense because when you learn something that's brand new, that new information, your brain may not know what to do with it. When you're learning something that you already have some related ideas about, it's much easier to connect to that. You can create analogies. For example, you may be a really good swimmer, and there may be a certain technique you use in swimming that allows you to understand a particular enzymatic process in chemistry more effectively. So there are a lot of different analogies that can be created in learning. There are a lot of different relationships that can be formed, and ultimately, there are a lot of ways that new information can be made sense of much more quickly. And when something makes sense, you will tend to remember it longer and much more easily than something that is just purely rote learned. So the snowball effect says you want to take your tiny little snowball and start that as early as possible. You don't want to be in a position where the first time you learn it is in class or in lecture. You want to have primed yourself beforehand with those techniques we talked about, building a little bit of those anchor points that new information can connect onto. And we want to do that as much as possible. We don't want to think by the end of the day I need to know everything. We want to accumulate that snowball so that by the time you sit the exam, you have everything. Because it's easier to accumulate knowledge when we're slowly adding more to it rather than trying to cram all of it in a single space. Which is why, another reason, that it's easier to learn diligently over time than it is to cram information. Last minute, not only is it just risky in general, but also it's the cognitive processes that are involved are much less taxing and much less error prone. And also you'll find that especially among the science subjects, when you learn something about, let's say, chemistry, it actually could make physics a little bit easier, which actually might make biology a little bit easier. There are certain things, bits of information that are a little bit transferable across the different topics, and you may have already felt this already. So when you're studying broadly, building little bits of knowledge, making sure you do the pre-study, learning a bit more and adding to that snowball in class, adding to it after the day, adding to it at the end of the week, and then adding to it at the end of the month, you will find that that process is much easier and much more doable than just being thrown into the class and not knowing what's going on. Likewise, actually later on we'll teach techniques that take this idea and really systemize it so that you can be way ahead of your class by an enormous amount and potentially even study an entire year's worth of curriculum before halfway through the year purely through self-study to the top 1% level. Actually very doable when we leverage the snowball effect almost in a weaponized, systematic way. And these are things that we will teach you, but you need to get, again, a little bit of experience with doing this. So The snowball effect should occur naturally if you are doing the pre-study, you're using the in-class techniques, and you're following these study schedules. This should happen naturally anyway, but I just wanted to explain to you a little bit from a neuropsychology point of view why it is that I'm telling you to do these things and how we're going to build on it in the future. Now, this is different to study scheduling because study scheduling just talks about when to do the revision, but the revision technique is what we're doing during those revision sessions. So if you haven't watched the study scheduling video, you can go and watch that first. However, this is, again, just the fundamentals. So whatever technique that you learn from here, if it's new, make sure that you're practicing it, giving it a go. If it is something that you're already doing, props to you, but we will be building on all of this in the course to come. This is just to lay that foundation. So whatever you're comfortable doing, just do that. Get comfortable, build a little bit of practice here. Don't stress too much about it though. The only way that you can fail this section is to not do anything. But if you do diligently apply these techniques and get a little bit used to them, then you'll start seeing some great benefits. When it comes to revision, there is a very basic triad that I teach to students. Each of these things we will actually elaborate on later on, and so they can actually be quite technical when we get down to how we can do it perfectly and extract the maximum amount of learning from it. But even if you do it wrong, you will still get quite a lot of benefit from doing this. And this triad is called test, target, and teach. And if you follow test, target, and teach, you're gonna be in the right ballpark of effective revision strategies. So when we say test, what we're saying is to make sure that you are applying your knowledge, and that's the most important thing. So the reason why past practice papers and past exams and things like that are so valuable as part of your revision is because it's forcing you to apply the knowledge, and applying knowledge is a different cognitive process to other forms of revision, especially when it comes to problem solving. And it gets a little bit technical and I won't go into it quite yet, but that's a big reason. This different process is a big reason why people find past questions and practice papers so effective for their revision strategy. But we can actually do this in a couple different ways as well. So you remember I talked about putting yourself in the perspective of an examiner and creating your own assessment questions. Well, this is another way that you can actually test your knowledge. The idea is that as long as you are applying the information in a way, you are going to be hitting it from an angle that you normally don't apply it in. And if you're trying to apply it in a way that you know you're probably not thinking about or not used to, then that's even better, which leads on to the second point, which was target. There is a very strong, quite a logical, but biologically wired bias for us when we're revising to actually focus on the things that we know we're better at. We almost don't want to admit that there's something that we don't know, maybe because it's destabilizing and it makes us feel anxious and nervous when a test or an exam is imminently coming up. But it's, for obvious reasons, very important to focus on the areas of weakness first. So when you're revising, if you have, let's say, 10 hours to revise and you spend 6 of those hours only revising the stuff that you already are pretty strong on, then that's a very ineffective use of your time. Even if there is stuff within the material that you're strong on that you're not 100% on, if there are things that you are very weak on and you're relegating that to the end of your study session or revision, or you're not prioritizing it, then that's the material that you know you have the lowest chance in getting good marks on, that you know is going to be accessible, that you are deliberately leaving until later and instead focusing on the 1 or 2 points here and there in the material that you're strong with. So we need to flip that order. Always start with your weakest area of revision first. So build the weakest areas until they are very strong, and then move on to your next weakest areas. And when you start doing this, you will start feeling much more confident with the information because you don't have that niggly thought in the back of your mind that there is stuff that you know that you're not very good on, that you're hoping they don't test you on. You shouldn't want that. You should be happy for them to test you on anything because you have focused on your weaknesses. And again, that method of testing through deliberately looking for ways of applying information that you may not be so comfortable with, that is a method of revision that is going to target your weaknesses as well as apply the information, which is why it's such a good technique. And even when you learn the later techniques, it's something that you should continue to take and carry on forward. And the final thing is teach. So teaching is really where it starts getting very technical because there are different ways to teach. And it even makes a difference whether you teach a group versus teach a single student versus teaching an imaginary student versus teaching an entire topic versus teaching a specific concept versus teaching an entire subject versus teaching mentally versus teaching out loud versus teaching while you're writing things or not writing things or drawing things and the order in which you teach things and then the frameworks that you use while you're teaching things and the terminology that you use. Every single one of these things actually changes the level of retention and learning that you get from that revision technique. So teaching is overall a really good strategy to use, but it can get really technical. We will go into that quite a bit later in the course. But for now in your revision, get into the habit of teaching the content to an imaginary student. Okay? As long as you're trying your best to teach it in a logical and effective way that seems to make sense, then you will be applying the information again in a different way. The difference in application between just testing your knowledge through the previous ways like asking questions and making questions and doing practice questions versus teaching it is that when you have questions, you're looking at it in terms of a problem-solving angle. When you are teaching it, you are focused on trying to compare and contrast different ideas with each other so that you can make sense of the information. For example, if you're teaching something and the way you teach it is literally just listing things out, down a line, fact by fact by fact, it's actually not very easy for someone to listen and understand it, which is not really teaching, right? That's kind of just more like narrating or dictating. Teaching means you have to make it make sense for the person that's listening. And when you try to make something make sense when you're speaking it, it forces you to think about, how am I going to express this? What's the order I'm going to use? What's my order or flow of ideas? How am I going to introduce these new concepts? How am I going to explain these details? What analogies am I going to use? It really forces you to examine the information from an angle that you usually don't look at unless, of course, you are naturally used to teaching for whatever reason. But it's often people will say that teaching is one of the most effective forms of revision, and I completely agree. Again, different levels of teaching. Some teaching is a little bit effective, some teaching is very, very effective, and it does get quite technical, so I'm not going to go into that quite yet. But for now, if you're not already using teaching as part of your revision, then you should definitely be using it. And I personally recommend that you use this as your 1 week revision. It's a really good balance point. It means that you're able to cover a lot of information through teaching, find a lot of gaps, and focus your revision in on those areas and target them. And it means that you can save your practice papers and your questions and all that hard problem-solving testing to your 1 month revision. So a few different techniques that we can use here, but if you follow the guidelines of test, teach, and target in whatever order that you want, then you'll be in the right ballpark, and you're going to find that your revision is a lot more effective overall. But again, remember, work with what you're comfortable with. Take the baby steps one at a time. Don't stress, don't overwhelm yourself. If it's too hard to do all of this stuff, just take what you can do and start with that. The important thing is that you build some momentum so that we make your later stages much easier and you get the benefits straight away from using these techniques as early as possible. Or just hard memorization. And it's a topic that is really under hot demand because a lot of people have problems with rote learning and memorization, and they think that that's the main issue. But what you'll find when you go through the course is that you're probably over dependent on rote learning, and a lot of students think, well, there's no other way to actually learn this. But I've extremely rarely found that to be true. In almost all situations, especially in easier content, for example, high school level or early university level, there is not a lot of information that needs to be rote learned. So for the university level, maybe around about 20-30% of the information ends up being rote learned, whereas at the high school level, only around maybe 10% of the information actually needs to be rote learned. And common feedback is that students are very surprised once they learn these other approaches of learning, how much rote learning they don't need to do. In fact, some students actually start getting insecure because they're not rote learning as much, and they're so used to rote learning. But it just means that this technique is just that powerful. However, rote learning is necessary. However, it should be used as a last resort. You shouldn't be depending on rote learning to learn everything. You should be relying on these other types of techniques However, I understand that as it is now, statistically speaking, the chances are you listening right now have a significant proportion of your learning through rote learning. Therefore, I'm going to teach you how to do it a little bit better so that when we teach you the later techniques, it's a little bit less stressful to swap these things out because you're not stressed so much and bogged down by the burden of having to rote learn so much. In the meantime, I do expect that you're going to have to rote learn a lot less as you learn other techniques throughout the course. However, appreciating that you do have a lot of rote learning, probably as part of your study system right now, I'll teach you some techniques about it. And one of the first techniques I'm going to teach you is the idea of basic association. And basic association is quite a simple thing to understand. It says that you can take something that you're trying to rote learn and you can associate that with something else. And then if that something else in itself is more memorable, you can create this association between them. So here's an example. Let's say that you need to remember that a certain type of pigment is red in color when exposed to UV light. So instead of memorizing that and just saying this pigment is red under UV light exposure, you may think of something that's red. Okay, what do you think of that's red? For me, I might think of a Porsche, a red Porsche. And then the next thing I'll think of is UV light. Well, what do I think of when I think of UV light? Well, I might think of sunlight. And so in that case, I might imagine a Porsche, a red Porsche under the baking hot sun. And I have to remember, baking hot sun, maybe in a desert, maybe the car is melting. Can you imagine that? And when you imagine that, now it's easier to associate that with thinking, okay, I remember this idea of like a melting red car under the baking hot sun in a desert. So, what does that mean? Right, sun, UV light, red car, red pigment. And then you can remember there's a certain pigment that's red when exposed to UV light. So that's how basic association works, is you take a certain idea and you find a type of memorable imagery, often something that's a little bit absurd, something that is a bit crazy. You don't want to think red pigment, oh, I'm going to imagine a red pigment. Under a UV light, oh, I'm going to imagine UV light spectrum. That's just not memorable enough. You need to think of something that's a little bit outside of the ordinary, something that if you were to see that in real life, that would make you stop and stare because it's so crazy and out of this world. Think of something that's a little bit absurd and then associate a type of imagery to it. And you can use this for individual facts, you can use this for lists, you can use this for numbers even, by associating certain numbers with certain types of imagery. So for example, you might think of the number 2 and the way that it looks and think, oh, that looks kind of like a swan. And so you might think of a swan when you think of the number 2. And you might think there are 2 molecules of certain type of gas. Well, you might think of that type of gas, and if it, let's say it's sulfur gas. Sulfur gas smells like rotten eggs. So you might imagine a swan, that's carrying rotten eggs, or a rotting swan, or a really stinky swan, or a swan inside a giant rotting egg, or a swan inside a swamp that's just like got all this, bubbly geothermal activity. You can think of stuff like that, right? And all of this is very memorable. And you can actually draw these images into a notebook or a mind map or on flashcards, and you can use that to make your memorization a little bit easier instead of just using words. Because remember, words are not very well processed. Our brain is honestly not very good at handling words, much worse than it is at handling images and visual information and imagery. So we want to leverage off that imagery as much as possible. And that's the idea of basic association, is that we're associating something which is quite a specific fact to something else like imagery or some kind of crazy other thing. And we're actually going to take that and we're going to build on it much later and see how we can integrate that into another system. But for now, give that a go and you'll find that it's pretty fun and enjoyable and quite effective. Also, I'm sure you can still remember the swan and the rotting swamp, and I'm sure you can still remember the melting red Porsche under the sun. And when this video finishes, I'm sure you're going to remember exactly what those two things stood for as well. So that just goes to show, even without trying to remember it, you remembered it. That's the power of basic association. Other two little things is to use active recall. And I've been talking about active recall before, but if you don't know, active recall just means to not read something and then just like, say it again, or not just, read it and then think, oh yeah, I understand this, because that's actually what's called recognition-based learning. Recognition means that if I show you this pen, you know that this is a pen, whereas recall means that you'd be able to draw the picture of that pen and know exactly what it looks like without having to look at it again. What you need is recall, because you're tested on recall. Recognition is not really going to get you anywhere, so you want to make sure that you're revising through active recall. The active part of active recall is the bit that people get quite misaligned on, because I think that any type of recall is active. The active is really talking about how much it activates your brain. So active recall in terms of problem solving without referring to the information, making mind maps, or teaching based on your memory, that is much more activating than, for example, just reading something, closing it, and writing it down again. Because that relies on only your short-term memory of that individual discrete thing. And if you're going to be using active recall, it's better to, number one, have a long delay between the time you saw it and the time you need to recall it, usually at least around 1 or 2 days. And it's also better if you're able to recall it in a way that's different to how you remembered it. So for example, if you remember the facts, try to apply it to solve a problem based on recall from memory without looking at your notes. So those are ways that you can optimize active recall. Now, I do talk about how active recall is not that great. It is good, it's just not something that you should over-rely on, because it is still about optimizing your memorization. And the approaches we're going to talk about, you will start seeing that they just veer away from memorization altogether and it becomes less necessary. And then the final thing is the idea of using something to help you with spaced repetition. With the study scheduling that I've already given you, you've already got expanding gap-spaced repetition in there. But the other thing that you can do is use digital flashcards. And I say digital because digital flashcards is superior to physical flashcards for a multitude of reasons. It's an incomparable. I find people that recommend physical flashcards laughable in how little they know about the neuropsychology of learning. It's just an atrocious idea. I would never recommend you use physical flashcards. And we're going to go into this a lot more in depth and explain why later on. But just for now, trust me, you definitely want to use digital flashcards. Least of all because digital flashcards have a spaced repetition algorithm built into it. And if you use a flashcard app that's anything that's worth its space on your phone, it will have the Leitner system built in by default or as a setting you can activate. So if you're unsure, just ask the developers or Google it and see if the app supports that setting. Go into the settings and have a look if you can activate the Leitner system for spaced repetition. And as long as you're following that, you should be able to find the spaced repetition a little bit more manageable. It's actually better not to do it in batches. So a lot of people will say, oh, Saturday is my flashcard day. I'll spend 5 hours doing flashcards. Or some people spend 5 hours a day doing flashcards, which is a whole other problem altogether, which again, we will talk about later. And right now, we're just not quite at the level where we can solve that. But a way to get over that is to just make sure that whatever flashcards you're using, you're trying to use basic association when you can to make it more memorable so that your ability to clear things is expedited. You're using all the other techniques I told you about in terms of in-class and pre-study and study scheduling. That's going to allow you to retain things a little bit more easily and have less flashcards that you need and clear them more easily as well. And just manage that load. And again, don't stack them all together because it means that you have an overwhelming amount of flashcards to do in one day. It's very daunting. It's actually better to do them every now and again, here and there throughout the day. For example, when you're on the toilet, what else are you going to do? Pull out some flashcards, do 3, 4, 5 flashcards. I don't know how many times you go to the toilet per day, but you can get a few flashcards done just on the bus, waiting for a friend, walking somewhere. These little moments and pockets of time that you can be utilizing, those are actually really effective times to use flashcards. It's actually more effective psychologically speaking than doing it in batch. And that's something called micro-learning, which again, we will talk about and how you can systemize a process based on that later in the course as well. But for now, just a few guidelines in terms of using basic association when you can, using active recall and optimizing the type of active recall that you're doing so it's more activating and a little bit more challenging and applying the information differently, and using spaced repetition not only through your study scheduling but also through digital flashcards with expanding gap spaced repetition with the Leitner system, and a few tips on how to make sure that you're handling and managing your flashcards until the point comes where you don't even need to rely on most of them because your other approach to learning is more effective, which again, we will learn throughout the course. So remember, if it's overwhelming to do all of this at once, just do what you're comfortable with. Start small, baby steps. If it doesn't work, give it another go, try to experiment, change a few things, try to make it work for you. If it still doesn't work, you let us know, we help you, and then as you progress through the course, you get better and better and better. You work, we work, everything works. But it has to start from you diligently applying some of these and building that momentum, which I think you've heard me say in every single one of these lessons, if you've been going in chronological order of the, what's on the page. But that's how important it is to just build that momentum. Don't dawdle, don't just sit on your hands and just don't do anything about it. Really get in there, start from tonight, start using these things, make a plan for yourself and really follow that schedule and make sure that you're just kicking off the first few weeks strong, and you'll find that your results a month, two down the line, you'll thank yourself for it.
So we're at our first fundamental checkpoint, and this is a very important checkpoint because it makes sure that there is no key gap or weakness that's going to be holding us back from moving on to the later stages. When we move into the later stages, we need to have a very, very strong foundation. Otherwise, errors will appear all over the place, and it's often very difficult to figure out where the errors are occurring. And most of the time, by the time we know the error has occurred, it's already been like weeks or even months since the error's initial onset before it really starts manifesting. And it took us a long time to figure out, and track back where these errors were coming from and realize it's a problem with, some fundamental aspect. And that's part of where this fundamentals course actually came from. I'll be going through the major components that we should have relatively down and confident with a reasonable level of competency and comfort with, lots of C's. And I'll talk about the relative importance of each of these parts so that you can make a judgment for yourself about whether you're ready to move on. There are some components that if you haven't done it or you haven't experienced it or if you haven't practiced it yet, that's going to cause a huge issue, and it's a big red flag. But then there are certain components that if you're not really super comfortable with it yet, we can potentially just continue working on that in the later stages, and maybe would say, hey, by now, if you haven't sorted that out, it's a big issue. But I'll explain the differences as we go through it. And we'll also take a look at some examples of work. So if you've got your own work, I would recommend actually having it out in front of you right now. So feel free to pause this, go grab that and have it in front of you so that you can actually compare what you're doing with the things that I'm saying to make sure that it ticks all of the boxes. The first thing that we need to make sure that we have sorted 100% is that we have actually practiced the techniques. Now, there is a surprising number of people that will go through the course and get to this point, and they've never really actually practiced using the techniques that they've been taught. One of the most common reasons for that is because they may have heard of a similar or related technique, or they may have heard of sort of one technique and they've used it in the past, or they either didn't find that it was effective or something. But there's some really important things that we need to understand about this. It's quite nuanced. Is number one, what we're trying to do is build a system. And even if you can do a single technique by itself, it may be very difficult to do that when you have, let's say, 3 or 4 other techniques that you're using simultaneously. And that's very, very common to find that individual techniques can be fine, but then when we put them into a system, the techniques start breaking down. So we need to have experience using at least most of these fundamentals in one go. Another, I find a little bit of an odd but common reason for people not to practice is that they may hear of a technique and they may have never really heard of trying this before. And as a result, they may think that it's not relevant for them because they've never heard of it, which I'm not completely sure about the logic there, but I've heard quite a number of students actually say that. So I'm saying it for you right now is that if that's the case and you're selectively learning some of these techniques, please don't do that. And the third thing is if you are wanting to learn more techniques to get more and more certainty about how to do the technique. You may not be applying the technique because you're not sure exactly how to use it, and you're thinking if you learn some of the later stages, you'll get a better idea about how it all fits together, and therefore you'll be able to be in a better position to actually start practicing and applying it. I'm going to tell you straight off the bat that is completely not going to happen. If you go further, your confusion will only grow because there are certain nuances and assumptions that we are going to be making about you and your level of technique and your experience. We are going to assume that you've tried some of these techniques. We're going to assume that you know how it works. We're going to assume you know how it, the most important one here, we're going to assume you know how it feels when you apply a certain technique and the type of cognitive load that it introduces, the type of discomfort it creates. We actually need you to feel the uncertainty and the not being sure and still trying it anyway, and then seeing how that feels and how it works for you. And we need you to actually do that a few times, because only when you've had that experience of managing discomfort, as well as actually trying techniques that you're not 100% sure about, but doing your best, feeling some of the limitations, feeling some of the strengths that and benefits it provides, and having all these questions, that actually primes you to being able to learn the later stages much more easily with a lot less error, and is incredibly consistent, like to a near universal level of consistency. When people aren't practicing the techniques by this point, the later stages are really an absolute mess. Like, we have people that are nearly finished the course whose technique level is worse than someone who is at this stage at the end of fundamentals, and it's tragic, and they're usually really demotivated, and there's nothing we can do at that stage. It's a waste of everybody's time, because these students will have to go and start the course all over again from scratch, but now they have to do it 3 times slower because they have to be extra careful about what they mislearned the first time around. So please, 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 please do not make that mistake. I have people always messaging me saying, hey, Justin, it's not clear that you're not meant to rush the course. And I just really, at this point, I do not think it's possible for me to make it any clearer. We need to be practicing, and if you're not practicing the techniques before you move on, it's not going to work out well for you, right? I'm going to say it this time once, make it a really big point here in the fundamentals, and I'm not going to belabor it in the later stages, just because this is like the, time opportunity for me to just really, really reinforce it. So let's move on to the main things, the criteria that we need. The first one was actually having an experimental mindset. We need to get used to managing that discomfort. So by now, you should have had at least, let's say, 4 or 5 separate occasions and experiences where you have learned a technique, you've tried to apply it, maybe you weren't sure, you felt some uncertainty, you felt some confusion, and you were trying to figure it out. You were really like a scientist experimenting with this and trying to figure it out and using your results and figuring out how you can get those marginal gains. That mindset is incredibly important as a fundamental. So that's number 1. We need to make sure that we've got that. And that is something that if we don't have yet, I strongly recommend that we do not move on until we have that. Mistakes that you make now are low risk, almost no risk, really. But if we hold off on that and only start making those mistakes when we're halfway through the course, that is just, it's really, really messy and very time costly to start fixing that. And it's just the worst position to be in, outside of just not being on the course at all. And in fact, actually, some students say that they would rather have not been on the course because they get to a position where they now know that their old techniques are wrong, but they feel incapable of doing it correctly because it's so overwhelming, and they don't even know where the errors are because there are hundreds of places that the errors could be. Here, if there's an error, there's only like 6, 7 places that you're likely to make an error. So if we can fix those 4 or 5 really important ones and the important mistakes that you make before you move on, that in itself stops that error from becoming, 20, 30, 40, 50 other errors later down the line. So that's the first point. The second one is that we want to have a level of experience with just trying to reduce the wordiness. Different people come into this course at different stages and with different techniques. Some people are very, very wordy and very linear with their note taking. Some people have an entire system built around just typing notes out or using apps like Notion or something else. And some people already come in with a little bit more of a refined technique that doesn't rely on such a linearity. And so it's really hard for me to know on like a pre-recorded video to know exactly where you are. This is a judgment you have to make for yourself. We have to reduce the amount of words that we're using. We need to try to get some experience, number 3, with writing some notes non-linearly, trying to show some of those relationships, trying to use a little bit more visualizations. And it's really important because relationships are incredibly important, and trying to represent and express relationships through words is very, very lengthy and tedious. Like, if you had 5 concepts and relationships between all 5 of them, it might be like a whole 3-page essay just to explain comprehensively and in detail what those relationships are. And in 99% of the cases, people are not even going to be willing to do that. They just don't even think about that because it just seems too overwhelming because they're so used to seeing things and thinking about things in terms of linear notes. So what we need to do is make sure that we are moving away from that. We're understanding how we can actually start expressing some ideas through arrows and, things on a page occupying different places in space, and start breaking into some level of non-linear note taking. It doesn't need to be amazing, but we need to start just getting a little bit more comfortable with expressing things without writing out, full sentences and paragraphs all of the time and relying heavily on bullet points. Number 4, and related to that, we should have some level of grouping and categorizing of information. This is really important, and it's actually probably one of the most overlooked steps. People get so focused on the relationship side that we forget about just the fundamental step of taking those relationships and starting to bring some of them together to see how can I take these 3 items and actually group them. Because they share really similar relationships, and trying to just simplify and categorize and group some of this information. This is a really critical skill that leads on to more advanced chunking techniques later on. But if we're not used to just the idea and habit of grouping information, it's going to be a very uphill slope to learn the more advanced techniques. Everything that I've said so far up until now, these are things that would be red flags if we don't have at least some level of experience and a little bit of comfort and competency with doing. A little bit of nonlinear note taking, trying to reduce our words a little bit, trying to show relationships, trying to group some information together, and being experimental in our mindset. If we don't have that to some level of comfort, even a little bit, just like starting to get used to it, then I would not move on until we get to that point where we are a little bit more used to it. The couple other things, so for example, exam revision techniques, your in-class technique, the spaced interleave retrieval, even if you don't have heaps of experience with this yet, that's something that we can just continue to work on for the next few stages. I definitely think we need to start implementing that, especially something like spaced interleaved retrieval. People can do the spacing really well, but they often don't do the interleaving very well. So just getting a little bit of experience with that so that we can actually start addressing that later on and refining it even further. But I understand that it's a little unfair to hold you back just because of that, when spacing by virtue is something that actually takes like weeks or sometimes even months to actually start getting really good at it with proper interleaving. As long as you're just making a start and you're intending to do that, I'm happy enough with that to leave it as it is. Things like in-class technique or exam technique and things like that, again, these are the sorts of things that you may not have the experience to really engage in quite yet, so I'm happy for us to continue working on that later. So let's now have a look at some of the work that's been produced by some other students and see where your work stacks up against this. And I'll sort of narrate and go through what I'm seeing, and you can have a look at your own work to see whether it fits in or not. So this is some work that was sent through by a student that is going through fundamentals. And so let's see, is this person ready to move on to briefing or not? And it's going to be subjective. If they're not comfortable with it, then, we don't need to push it. It's pretty hard to go too slowly, and it's really easy to go too fast, so we keep that in mind. But we can see that they're demonstrating relationships. They've got some of this basic grouping of information that we can see here, and we can also see that they are representing information non-linearly. They're trying to cut down on their words. They're using some images here. They occasionally copy-paste images, which is not the best thing to do, because the work involved in trying to think of the images can be quite challenging, and that in itself helps with the learning. But overall, it's looking really, really good, and I'd be happy based on this for them to move to fundamentals. The one thing that I'm not liking is that they're typing this out. They're doing all of this digitally, and it's a lot better to not type it and to actually write it. In these early stages, we're not going to see the benefit of writing it by hand. It just seems like an unnecessary additional step. But when we start transitioning these techniques into something that's more advanced, we'll find that just typing it actually limits us in a lot of ways and reduces cognitive load in levels that we don't want, that can negatively impact on our learning. So we do want to get into the habit of just doing it freehand wherever possible. This is another work that's sent by the same person, and we can see that there's relationships, there's non-linear aspects, it's not too wordy. There is a lot of copy pasting going on, so again, that's not the best. It creates an illusion of good notes sometimes, because we feel good because we've got all this information on here, but actually it's copy pasted. So we may not have actually processed it in our brain, and we may therefore not really hold on to it very well. But, you know, this is again something that they can probably just work on as they progress through the other stages. It's not something that I'd say needs to hold someone back, because they are trying to cut down on their words. They are experimenting with visuals. It's relational. There's some grouping going on. Now, there's lots of things that we can work on. It doesn't have great flow. It's a little messy. It's a little bit hard to follow. They're going to find that it might be a little bit time consuming. They may feel overwhelmed, but these are all normal things to face in these early stages. And it's a good setup for the later stage techniques where we start slowly addressing those things a step at a time. But this is a good foundation. Let's have a look at another one. This is one that was sent through by a student that's studying, obviously you can see cell structure and function as a topic. So we're seeing it's not too wordy. We're seeing relationships. We're seeing some very basic attempts at chunking. We're not seeing too many visuals. So that's one thing that this person might want to start working on. But again, it's not enough for me to say that we'll hold them back. They are not being too wordy, so I'm okay with that. The one thing that makes me a little cautious is that it's very simple in terms of the amount of information that's on here. There's a lot of detail that's missing, and I'd really like this person to start exploring, incorporating more information on their notes. And when you increase the amount of information you're trying to represent on your notes, it creates new types of challenges, new types of difficulties that can reveal different types of errors, different types of mistakes will pop up, which is again really great fuel for improvement when we learn techniques to fix that. So the only thing that I'd say is a little bit iffy is that they haven't really had too much information on this. However, it's definitely still pretty solid, and I wouldn't say that we need to hold someone back because of this. But if they wanted to stay at fundamentals and just work on this before moving on, adding more information, I'd say that that's a perfectly good idea as well. This is something that was sent through by another student, and you can see it's again in the field of science. It's not written in English, but we can still see there's good relationships. There's some level of grouping that's going on. We can see that there are basic groups being formed. We've got groups here, a little bit of grouping here, groups here, grouping. It's pretty simple types of grouping that's occurring, but there's definitely an effort being shown here to group information. It's not too wordy. The amount of information that's on this is fair enough. It's not really visual, so maybe increasing the use of some abstract visuals will be useful. This person may really struggle with that, but it just means that we need to train that up from an earlier stage and just keep consistently working on it. But this is, this would be good. They'd be ready to move into briefing. This is another piece of work sent by the same person, and those that are a little bit later in the course will look at this and say, hey, there are a few issues here in terms of the way that they're actually chunking and structuring the information. But again, in these early fundamental stages, just the attempt alone, this is perfectly enough. We can start cleaning up this technique as we go. And another piece of work, again, by actually the same person here. And we're seeing that they're starting to use some visuals, and this is actually a really good visual that's being used. There's some color there. They've really tried to integrate certain ideas together. We can see they're attempting to use a bit more visuals, and that's good. This person can actually do a little bit of what's called keyword anchoring. They should really include some of the keywords underneath the images as well, and that helps to just anchor the picture in. And they may be facing some issues potentially with what's called hieroglyphics, but that's something that we start thinking about more in briefing and technique training. But again, for now, it's relational. It's not too wordy. There is, grouping that's being shown here. And this person is obviously willing to, give it a go and use these techniques. So this is really, really good. Very strong start, and they'll be able to move into briefing, and I wouldn't have any concerns about them for the next couple of stages. Now, this is a different type of example from looking at something that's a little bit more arts, literature, history, things like that. And so it's going to look a little bit different. And what we're seeing is that there is a sort of sequence that they're showing. There's lots of visuals that are here. But what we're not seeing is that the ideas are really grouped together, and we're not really seeing relationships. We're seeing just more of a single process and a flow. And in terms of the relationships, it's not quite there. So this is somewhat a position where I'd say maybe we want to stay at fundamentals for just a little bit longer and start thinking about how can maybe some of these stages of events be grouped together a little bit? How can we start thinking about how certain points of these might be related to other points, and start trying to build a little bit more of a network rather than just a single chain, which if you forget one part of the chain, it then starts affecting your ability to encode and remember other parts of the chain as well. It creates a higher risk type of structure for the information. So this is an example where, because they haven't really grouped things together and there's not too much in the way of relationships, it's not really ready to move on. They're obviously doing a great job with the visuals, probably more than needs to be actually, but these other things that we need to work on is holding them back. But they are obviously giving it a go, and so that's a really big positive sign. This is something sent through by the same person again. They're saying that on reflection, it was very complicated and they found it difficult to remember. They thought it was because of the lack of visual cues that made it difficult to remember. But in reality, it's probably not. It's going to be due to the grouping of the information. So here we see something where they've got lots of things and lots of relationships everywhere. In fact, there's so many relationships going everywhere, it's hard to even know what's happening. So this is an example of someone who kind of meets some of the criteria, and we can actually start cleaning this up. But because they are showing relationships, because they are doing some basic groupings, this is actually probably good enough to start moving on. How they can improve their memory of these things is actually going to be, number one, just spacing things out a little bit more so that we can actually see the arrows and it just lets it breathe a little bit. And when we start grouping it together at a higher level of quality, when the groups get higher quality, it becomes easier to remember because higher quality groups are often more logical. But we haven't learned the techniques on how to do those high quality groups yet. And that's the thing that's going to hold them back. But they're really giving it a go, trying to create relationships. There's some grouping going on here. It's not very verbal. It's not too wordy. So overall, this is a good thing. Here again, from the same person, they're showing, a very similar thing. Now this falls into the same issue as last time, where there's maybe not enough information, but it looks like they're just trying to get some of the themes and things together. There's some relationships, but we're not seeing a whole lot of grouping that's going on here, and that's the thing that's going to hold them back. This is all the same person that's shown here. So what we can say is that this person has the right idea with some of these techniques, but they're not super consistent with it. So if they wanted to spend another week or two at fundamentals, just putting a bit more focus on making sure we've got good relationships and groups, then they're going to find that when they move to the later stages, they'll be able to go through it much more quickly. However, if they wanted to move on, I don't necessarily think that they need to be held back because of these issues, as long as they're aware of it and they're working on it as they continue to move on. Now this one, you give it a go. Spend a little bit of time to look at this and ask yourself, is this person ready to move on based on what you can see here? All right. And the answer is that yes, they probably can move on. It's not too wordy. There are relationships being shown. There are some very basic grouping that we're getting here as well. It's not super clean. It's not perfect. The images can use a little bit of work. The relationships and the chunking and everything can be better. But for this current stage, it's a great step in the right direction. And we can clean up the rest of the technique and improve the quality as we go. But for this person, it's a good, strong start. They're definitely of a mindset where they're willing to give it a go. They're going to be able to continue moving on. And this particular person, I know for a fact, has actually gone on to do quite well as well. Now, what about this one? What do you think about this one? It's a little bit sideways, but there's a few things that we should still be able to pick out from this. So based on what you're seeing here, I hope you arrived at the same conclusion that for this person, they probably should not move on yet. There are some things that they are doing which are really good and positive. However, there are a lot of things that need to be improved before we actually really move on. For the first thing is that it is still quite wordy. And for this person, just the size of their paper and the fact that they're using lined paper is actually going to frame them into being more likely to do it wrong. It's quite wordy. We have some very basic relationships, but there's not a lot, and we can see that none of these are grouped together. There's just really single points being connected with just one other point. There's not really grouping, and it's very, very linear. It's very, very wordy. Again, it's pretty isolated. We've got a little bit more relationships and a little bit more grouping here, but only the most basic, only the most obvious. And again, very, very wordy, lots of lists, lots of writing, overall a very linear progression. And we're not seeing these ideas sort of coming together. We're not seeing more relationships. We're not seeing them reducing the wordiness. We're not seeing much, if any, attempts of actively grouping the information and categorizing it together by themselves. Anyone that has a working understanding of chemistry will be able to read this and realize that the groups that they are creating are usually just the groups that were already taught to them. It's usually presented in a group, and so it's not that they are actively making groups themselves, it's that they are just writing down the group that was already given to them. So obviously there's no cognitive load involved in doing that. It's a very passive process, and so we're not going to get much learning out of it. They've got the idea that they need to connect relationships, but it's pretty obvious that the most important thing for them is just getting information on the paper. And then afterwards, they're just saying, all right, well, let's just draw some arrows to connect things together to show that they're related, rather than really thinking about these relationships and putting that at a higher priority. And that mindset is completely incompatible with most intermediate level techniques. So until that mindset changes, we're not going to be ready to learn any of the intermediate techniques. It's going to cause a lot of confusion. There's going to be almost complete technique failure if we try to do that. So for this person, they need to stay at fundamentals for quite a lot longer. You can see it's very, very wordy, very, very linear, no relationships, no grouping, no visualizations. Same thing going along here, same thing over here. And just generally, that's the overall trend. Now, this is a person that actually sent this through while they were at technique training, which is 2 stages beyond the end of fundamentals. As you can see, their level of technique is actually worse than the level of technique that we have actually seen in some of the previous pieces of work. And as you get further in the stages, you'll start to realize how detrimental some of these practices when it comes to studying are, and how limiting it is at being able to do certain types of thinking. There are certain types of thinking where when you write linear notes that aren't optimized for relationships and groups, it becomes incredibly tedious, incredibly challenging to represent certain types of information. And it's like having a heavy weight shackled to your brain. It's trying to learn in a certain way, and it's being held back significantly. So this would be an example. We're not quite ready. We really need to stay at fundamentals for quite a lot longer and just really wrap our head around it. You can see that just the process of making it less wordy is going to be a challenge. The process of figuring out relationships, being more non-linear, all of these things are going to be pretty significant changes that this person needs to make. And that's going to take a little bit of time. There's probably a lot of habits built up that's going to hold this person back. So have a look at your work and ask yourself, where am I with regards to my technique? And am I ready to move on with regards to the metrics and the checkpoints that we need to meet at the end of fundamentals? And if you are in a position where you realize, yeah, I need to stay back and work on a few things right now, then don't be disheartened. This is a completely natural and normal part of the progress. There's very, very few, well, actually no one goes through the course just getting everything right. No one does that. It doesn't happen. A lot of these techniques, even just really nuanced things that I might say in just a single lesson, that when you hear it might be, yep, cool, that's just one technique. Some of those techniques, it took me 5-6 years of trial and error to actually figure out when no one was teaching me. Even if it might seem simple, it is a very specific sequence and a very specific combination of what we're trying to do. And if you realize that there are certain things that it's in your best interest to hold off on for a week or even a little bit longer to work on them before moving on, and do yourself a favor, take that time, take things pretty patiently. You'll more than make up for that in the later stages by how smoothly and how error-free you'll be able to progress. If you get to Ascent 2 and Ascent 3 and there's a fundamental error there, you can easily spend 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 months just fixing that single issue. That's just how complicated it can be, and all of that time is really wasted. Whereas the alternative is that you could pass through it smoothly in just 1 or 2 weeks if you had all of the other things perfectly in place. Not to mention the fact that if you've got good fundamentals, you're actively saving time in your ability to actually study on a day-to-day basis as well by increasing your retention. Which does bring me to the very last point that I want to talk about before we move on, which is the concept of saving time and speed. The misconception, which I completely understand, and I think I should probably make this clearer, is that when you learn a technique, once you're getting better at it, the trick is to then do it faster so that you can then save time. And that is true to an extent, but the time save that you get mostly does not come from that. Most of the time that you save will actually come from the technique itself. The technique itself is inherently more time efficient. And when you can do that technique accurately, it, by virtue of the nature of the very technique, starts to save time. You don't have to actually try to be faster to start saving time. All you have to do is make sure that you're using the techniques accurately, and with accuracy comes increased efficiency. When you learn the later techniques, you learn more efficient techniques. And if you can do the more efficient technique more accurately, again, that saves you time. And in fact, the time lost, time wasted would come from doing a technique inaccurately, which creates errors that you then need to spend time to fix or review in your retrieval sessions and things like that. Speed of doing things is actually a very minimal concern. If you go through the course and you're able to do each technique accurately, and at no point do you ever think about trying to go faster, you will improve your time efficiency massively without even trying. It's basically impossible not to increase your time efficiency if you use the techniques correctly. You would have to actively try to slow down in order to get to a point where it's not significantly improving your overall time efficiency. It's just the nature of the technique. So accuracy is priority 1, 2, and 3. Time efficiency, time saved, that will come without even trying. And when you often when you try to work on speed, when the accuracy is not there, it just increases the error rate, which means that it takes longer to do the technique accurately, which means that it takes longer for you to progress to the next stage. It increases the risk of errors that are occurring. It means that you have to spend more time repetitively retrieving it. And overall, there's much more time wasted because of it. The amount of time that you might have saved if everything went perfectly from just trying to be faster is maybe like 5 or 10%, which is just completely not worth the risk. That's just the final point there. Speed will come. It's impossible for it not to come. You don't have to think about it. Just work on the accuracy, especially in these early stages. And do note that for the couple early stages, you may not feel time efficiency even with accurate technique, and that's purely because the version of the technique that we're teaching you is the one that is at the fundamental level. For some people it does save time straight away, but for some people they will feel that it's difficult to save time or even be as fast as they were doing it before. But again, we have to think about the level of mastery we're really achieving with our knowledge. If it takes us an hour to have a higher level of knowledge mastery for a smaller amount of information, versus an hour to cover more information, but to a very superficial level where we're then going to forget it, well, then how long would it take later to get to that level? We may have to do 2 or 3 extra hours of past papers or flashcards or quizzing each other to get to that same level that we got to in that 1 hour. So in that case, it's really not even less time efficient. It's only slower if you're thinking about it in terms of like the single study session when you're sitting down at a desk. Yes, you may get through less stuff in a single hour, but actually overall, you actually may be getting through more in a shorter period of time when you also consider the depth of learning that's achieved in that time as well. And that's a bit of a tricky thing to get your head around, but do start thinking about that. If you did meet all of the checkpoints, great. Continue to move on. If you didn't meet all of the checkpoints, great. We now know that. We'll go back, revise that. We'll check up on the checkpoint video again if you need to. Together, and I'll demonstrate how we can use all of these skills in a full system at this point in your progress. We'll be using the curriculum that we have available. If you haven't looked at this yet, it gives you an overview of everything to expect in the entire learning system, or at least the major points, and it's been designed in a way that you can use as a practice resource. So I'll be going through that, and I'll be showing you how you can actually be applying these skills. It's going to be best for you to give this a go by yourself first, so that you can actually compare what you were able to do with what I'm going to do. If you don't try it yourself first, and you just watch this video, and you just see how I do it, then you're not going to get as much value from it. You won't have made certain mistakes, and you're not going to pick up on certain details and nuances in the way that I'm doing the technique if you haven't had some of that experience in the past before. So if at this stage you haven't tried using your full set of techniques on studying that material, then I'd recommend you go through and do so now and then come back to this. If you've already done that and you've got your work in front of you, then we can go into a comparison mode. I'm going to assume that you've done that, and so I'm not going to be talking about a lot of the smaller little mini steps. I will be trying to narrate some of the important decisions that I'm making in the learning process, but just note that I am going to be expecting that there is inherent relevance to you because you've already had the experience of trying to do it yourself. So let's jump onto the computer and see how I'm going to study this with a fundamentals level of skill. So I've got my tablet here in front of me and I'm ready to go through the material. I'm going to make sure that I scope everything out first, and so in a video setting, like a online recorded lecture, one of the ways that you can do that is to simply skim through it as quickly as possible. There may be a guide that's already presented for you that has all the main concepts. It could be lecture slides, in which case you may not even need to listen to the lecture recording first, especially if you are doing this and no recordings are even available whatsoever, either before the lecture and they haven't released anything, or even afterwards they may not give you some kind of recording. Even in that type of situation, you can just use at least whatever is available for you. So for example, what we've done is we've made it easier for you by actually giving you a list of all the concepts. So you don't have to go through and listen to the entire thing and collect all those keywords. We've actually done that step for you to save a bit of time. However, if that wasn't available, then I would just be listening to this double speed, or what you can sometimes do is download the file and then put it through some kind of transcription software. There's lots of different speech to text transcribing softwares that are out there that you can look for. You can plug it into one of those and that will actually get all of the words that were spoken and put them into text so that you can skim through it very quickly. Some of them cost money, but they may be worth it in the end. So either way, we're going to go through and have an understanding about what's going to be covered in the topic and end up with the first step, which is just collecting a list of basic keywords around what the topic is about. This is a great step to start with, and it's a good way to begin the very first step, which is our pre-study and priming. Now, my main objective here is to just build that basic knowledge schema using some nonlinear note taking and just create some very, very simple groups. This is not a super time consuming process, and it really shouldn't be something that you allow yourself to spend that much time on, because it might mean that you're focusing on too many of the details too early. So let's download this concepts list to help us. And while we're at it, we're also going to download a few other things. We'll download this summary document here. And we're going to download our textbook, which in this case is the report on learning document. Let's open up all of the documents so that we can look through them all. We know that the report on learning document is going to be a more like that textbook. It's denser, it's more technical, it's deeper, and it covers some of the material in a way that is not necessarily relevant for this particular lesson, but it could help us to understand and deepen our knowledge either now or later when we're studying through it properly. But for now, we're not going to focus on it too much because all we're looking for is to build that basic understanding for our pre-study and our priming. The summary document, which could be like a lecture guide or some kind of course guide or something, this is going to be really useful because it allows us to, again, skim through and get some of those main ideas and just understand some of those main relationships. So we'll start here with just the concepts list. And looking through this, I already have some very, very simple ideas about ways that I may possibly group it. So if you look through this list, you will also find possible ways that you can group it. And it doesn't mean that that is the group that you will always end up with. It could just be an idea of a group that you have, and you can use that as a hypothesis to build off of next. But what's important is that we do at least build that hypothesis. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through the concepts list, and I'm going to go through the summary document, and then I'm going to just try to create general big groups and general relationships and express them out here on my map software. As usual, I'm using Concepts for this, which is the name of the app. All right, so right now what I've been doing is I've just been going through the list of keywords, and I've just been grouping things together in what just intuitively feels like they're probably talking about
more similar things. So for example, when I read the word retention, I'm feeling like it's going to be a very different thing from the word motivation, which I've written here. And you can see that I've actually grouped it differently. Now, it may end up being that these two actually do belong in the same group later. However, for now, I'm happy with just leaving them separate because it just feels as though they would be separated, and just in my very simplistic view. And this basic ability to group information is already activating some higher order thinking. I'm comparing ideas against each other. I'm looking for similarities and differences. And I'm just trying to get a sense for how the information might fit. Already I'm starting to see how some groups may affect other groups. But right now, I'm not really caring too much about that. I'm just trying to create some very, very basic groups. One thing that will be different with your experience of doing this is that you may not know straight away, looking at all the keywords, what it actually means. And so you may need to spend a little bit of time to read up about it, either in the textbook that we've got available here, or in the summary document, or through Google. Now, I'm not going to show you all of those steps because they're relatively simple, but I will just demonstrate that with just one. So here we've got the idea of microlearning. Now, I haven't yet written microlearning on my schema yet. So if I read that word and I didn't know what the word meant, and let's say that this wasn't available for us, this list, and so we're collecting the word from scratch, in that case, I would be listening to the video or looking at the transcript or looking through the textbook or the guide or whatever other resource, and I would have seen this as a heading or a bold word or a paragraph that talks about it, and I would have thought, this looks important, and that's why I wrote it down. But at the time, maybe I didn't read up enough about it to really have an understanding about what it meant. And that can commonly be the case if you're looking at it from, for example, just a lecture transcript, in which case you don't really have the time to listen, to the 2 to 3 minutes before and after every single word to figure out what it means. In that case, you just may as well watch the whole lecture, and that's not going to be very time efficient. So in this is sort of, a worst case scenario. A word is on here. I have no idea what it means. I don't even remember where I found it from. I don't know anything about it. All I know is that it looked like an important concept, so I wrote it down, and I need to figure out where I'm going to group this. So here's exactly what I would do. I'll look through probably the densest, most comprehensive resource that's available for me. In this case, it's going to be this textbook. So I'm just going to very quickly go through here, and I'm going to search for the word micro learning to see if it comes up. That didn't come up. I'll search for the word micro. So that didn't come up either. So that suggests that that word isn't in this resource. I'll look through this course guide. I'll look for the word microlearning again. So here we see the word microlearning has appeared in the middle of the page. So I'm just going to read this paragraph very briefly. So after reading this, we can see that it doesn't really help very much. We know that there's some relationship with interleaving and spacing. However, it's not enough for us to really get an understanding about what it means. So I'll very quickly Google it. One of the first things that I'll usually do for something like terminology is I'll straight away go to Google Images, because often there can be a diagrammatic representation that just shows me straight away what the gist of it is without having to read through too many articles. And I can see at a glance all the different sources of information from multiple different websites without clicking into each individual link and reading through it. Again, I'm leveraging that ability for visual processing in something as small as this. So I can see a little table here. That looks quite good. Let's see if this is going to be relevant for me. So I'll open this in a new tab, and we'll just zoom in on this. So from reading this table, I'm getting the idea that microlearning is about things that are very short in intervals. They're usually more isolated based on single concepts or skills. It doesn't look like there are too many other major differences from this. So I'm getting a general gist of what microlearning might mean. So let's look at some of this other material here. So here's another thing. So let's open this one in a new tab. You can see where all these are coming from. This one is coming from TechTarget. This one is coming from Venngage. So this is obviously a little bit more comprehensive now. So again, I'm getting the idea of indexing and doing things in compressed time periods. But another thing I'm seeing is that this is a lot to do with how you should teach in microlearning rather than an individual learning with microlearning. And that's kind of a different angle. So I want to learn a little bit more about this. I can see that it can be really effective, supporting long-term retention by up to 80%. So there's obviously something that's really significant about this. That's a little bit too much. Microlearning, bite-sized knowledge. There's the idea of self-paced. So already I'm starting to get a general understanding of it. I don't have a clear picture yet. I couldn't really explain it to someone, but the trends I'm getting are that it is small steps of learning and shorter time intervals. And apparently it's very effective. So it's saying here again, like less than 10 minutes. So now I feel I have a general enough understanding of microlearning to start thinking about how it could fit in. So if I look again in comparison with all the other concepts that are on this list and I'm thinking about how it's relevant, well, now I can start to see how spacing and space retrieval might be relevant to microlearning, because spacing is the idea of taking time and having gaps between these sessions, and then microlearning are these small sessions. So maybe it's the idea of having small sessions and then spacing those small sessions out. So I'm getting a general understanding of it. Again, not very deep, but that's all I need to just create this hypothesis of this frame. So I'm actually going to put microlearning over here right next to where I had all my stuff about spacing. So I would go through and do that for this entire group of information. So I'm going to finish off this basic grouping, and then we'll go into how we're then transforming that into something that is a nonlinear representation of ideas and how we're going to use the remaining resources. So first, I'll just create my basic hypothesis of my groups. And again, for most people, this is going to be a process where you're going back and forth and looking at Google and Google Images and things like, just like I have for a lot of these keywords. A lot of the time you won't have to do that. You will have an idea about what some of those keywords mean, especially if you have pretty good prior knowledge. We'll talk in later stages about how that prior knowledge can actually be deceiving and actually can hold you back from creating some good groups, but that's a little bit advanced for right now. All we're worried about right now is creating some pretty decent groups, doing that back and forth higher order thinking to figure out what makes sense, and then trying to represent that in our notes somehow. So let me just go ahead and finish this concepts list. Good, so I finished this concepts list, and I should note that the groups that I formed are not necessarily the groups you should form. And in fact, they're actually not the best groups. I've deliberately grouped them in a way that I think someone that is at the fundamentals level may group them. In fact, there are actually much better ways that it can be grouped, and there's much more that can be done with this. But I've just left it like this for now as a demonstration. So don't feel that you need to follow and copy the groups that I've created necessarily. The other thing is that while I'm doing this, I'm thinking about how each of these different things is also related to each other. So I'm sort of building a disorganized, very basic web of knowledge. However, what's also important is that thinking of relationships and back and forth, that nature of thinking can be quite overwhelming. So it's actually very normal, even during this initial process, to feel quite overwhelmed, because now you're going through all these concepts and thinking there are so many keywords and concepts and things to know. There's so much to know, and then a lot of students will at that point feel very pressured to start just learning more about it, to just start tackling this big workload. And while that's understandable, because there seems like a mountain of work, we better get started and dive into it, we need to actually hold off on that. So understand that it's normal for this process here to feel quite overwhelming, but it's important to stick with the technique, because a little bit of preparation work before we dive into it is going to make it much easier for us to process the information in the first place, and for us to eventually hold on to that information and use it to a higher level. So these are all very important subtleties with the technique that, again, you've probably already experienced when you were doing it. Maybe you found that you went halfway through this process and you sort of stopped. Right now, this did not take me very long. I believe it took around about 10 minutes or so for me to actually finish doing all of this. In reality, for you, for an entire topic like this, and this would be considered a reasonably large topic, this may take you something like 20 or 30 minutes. But again, not that long. It would only take long if you start going too deep into every single word to figure out exactly what it means. But just remember the example I gave before. All I needed was that general understanding, that very superficial level understanding, to just start thinking about how it could be grouped together. That's all that's important at that pre-study stage. So if this is all you were able to do before you went into the lecture, that would still already be a win, but ideally we want to push that a little bit further. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to label some of these groups. I'm going to add some keywords to represent what each of these groups actually mean, and I'm going to start trying to map it out so I can see some of these relationships. While I'm doing that, I'm going to notice that some of the things that I grouped aren't actually grouped in the way that it really should be. Some of these things are grouped in ways that I felt it should be grouped, but now that I look at the relationships, I'll realize that I want to move things around. And again, that's normal and that's okay. You can reorganize your groups as you're doing this relationship and mapping process. The other thing that I'll be looking at is simplifying some of these groups. For example, you can see in this group, there are many items. That's going to be overwhelming. So I'm going to look at how I can create subgroups within each of these groups. But the first thing to do is just generally label what each of these things are. So I'll just do that in red here. So you'll see that when I grouped these things together, I'm giving them keywords that are very easy and simple to understand. And it's important to do this because, number one, it actually makes us to think again at a higher order by relating it to the things that we already know and find intuitive. For example, thinking about problems or outcomes, this is something that doesn't require me to study more to understand. I already know how to think about outcomes or problems or skills or planning. So because I'm using simpler language, this allows me to think about how the groups are related to each other a little bit more simply. But as I'm doing this, I'm also now seeing some issues. So for example, I'm thinking that spacing is actually really a type of skill, as is planning. So now I'm inclined to actually make both of these subgroups within skills. And again, this is normal, and we're going to be reorganizing this as we go. Another thing that you might notice is that I've used a word like self-management here as the label for this group, even though that exact same term is inside that group. It's one of the keywords, one of the concepts inside the group, and I've used the same wording. Again, here I called this spacing, but spacing is actually one of these words. And again, that is fine as well. Sometimes you'll find that one concept really does summarize all of these sub-concepts, and you can use that as a word as long as that word feels intuitive and simple enough. If it's a brand new piece of terminology that you've just come to, and just thinking about what that word even means already takes up effort, you don't want to use that as the name for your group, because then it's going to become overwhelming to think about how all of it is connected together. So in this case, self-management, I feel pretty happy with calling it that because it seems simple and intuitive enough. Spacing, likewise, it feels intuitive enough, so I'm happy to label it like that too. So now I'm just going to go through and create some basic maps where I feel confident with. And as I'm creating some of these maps, I'm going to try to simplify some of these groups to see if I can break them down into subgroups. And you will see that as I do this, there's a lot of thinking about it. There's a lot of back and forth, and I'll be reorganizing things every now and again. I'll be breaking some of the groups and redistributing some of those concepts to other groups. I may even end up creating some new groups depending on how I feel about this process. Now, again, this depends on your skill level and the size of the topic. This entire process, including what I'm about to do next, may only take you 20 or 30 minutes. Or in some cases, if you're doing, let's say, an entire week's worth of content, it might take you an hour or so. And again, as long as the amount of time you're spending on it is small relative to the total scope. For example, for 1 hour, I'd usually recommend no more than sort of 15 minutes. Whereas if you're doing sort of 5 hours worth of lecture material, you may legitimately spend 45 minutes to an hour to cover it. So just keep that in mind. You shouldn't ever let yourself take too long, because it likely means that you're getting sucked into the details too much, and that's going to be a technique issue, and it's going to make things much more difficult. So let's go through and create this basic map. So I've created a general frame, and you can already see how this entire topic is starting to actually look like it makes more sense. Now, again, I will say I've deliberately made a few mistakes here that will be common for someone at the fundamentals level to make. And you'll see how the more advanced strategies, although they're more difficult to actually use and it requires you to have a certain level of habitual processing ability and usage of some of these basic techniques to be able to pull it off, how those techniques can actually avoid these mistakes. They're very difficult to avoid otherwise. One thing that can help to catch these errors is, again, by really thinking about the groups you've formed and whether the individual concepts within them make sense. So, for example, I've grouped this as research and improvement. But now that I'm thinking about it, and I'm thinking, well, do each of these things fall within the idea that that is contributing to research that allows us to produce these skills? I'm thinking, not really, because some of these things, namely these ones here, these are not actually to do with the research. This is actually about our ability to practice it and develop the right skills. So actually, I'm going to need to create an entirely new chunk based on this, and I'm going to call this practice. And I'm going to add that in here. In this case, it ended up being quite clean. I could simply just add it on underneath and it still looks relatively clean. But in a lot of cases, probably most cases, you would actually have to break your structure, move things around, or in some cases actually just start it from scratch because you realize that there's a better way and a simpler way of grouping that information. Now, within skills right now, I would have two items. I'll highlight them here. I would have grouping and note-taking. So I'm going to say that's fine. I could add that underneath there. Under self-management, I would have motivation, discomfort, habits, time and task management, procrastination, and focus. That's a little bit much. There's this thing called the 2-4 rule, which means that we want to aim for 2 and at most 4 points under any individual group. So right now we would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different points. So I'm going to find a way to subgroup that. So I would maybe think of motivation and habits and time and task management, or maybe motivation, habits, and discomfort in one group, and then focus, procrastination, time and task management as another group. I could think, in my mind, I'm thinking about it in terms of self-management of feelings versus self-management of maybe actions or behaviors. So I could do self-management of, let's say, emotions, and then self-management of actions. Again, the labels that I'm giving are very simple terminology, nothing that I have to think too much about. So how would I actually add the information underneath this general frame? So I would literally do it like this. So for example, if under emotions, we're talking about motivation and, let's actually say motivation, discomfort, and procrastination, because that's probably a bit more accurate. I would literally write it like this. I would just write motivation, procrastination, and discomfort. As simple as that. I'm not going to do that for the entire map just to save some time, but you can see how I would be adding things on for everything else. So similarly for actions, I will be adding on time and task management. And I'd also be adding on focus here as well. I think there's one more that we're missing, which is habits. As we continue to learn more in the later stages, this can be built on progressively, more and more and more. So for example, we might find that there is a relationship between motivation and procrastination and habits, in which case we may actually want to represent that these things are actually related to each other, like that. So we could create this type of relationship. But you'll find that it's very messy to create relationships if you don't do the overall structure very well, because you'll end up with points that are sort of one out here and then one over here, and then you realize they're related together, and you draw this big arrow going across, and then that's related to this thing, and that's related to this thing, and that's related to this thing, and it becomes impossible to follow. And that would be because things that really should have been in the same group were kept in different groups. And so we're trying to represent the relationship spreading across the entire map. That's an issue with the way that we created the groups in the first place. So again, spending a bit of time to really get the groups good as possible in the first place pays off in the long run. Likewise, with the group like practice, you can see that there are multiple different points here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And again, I'd just be thinking about how I can subgroup that into maybe 3 different subgroups, maybe even 4 different subgroups, so that I could branch that off, and that would look something like this, something like that, and then I'll be able to fill that in. So I'd continue with this process until I feel like I've covered all of those major key concepts and keywords, and I'd end up with a map that allows you to have a surprisingly good level of understanding about the topic, even though you haven't really spent a very long time actually learning it in that much detail. And that means that when you go into the lecture or whatever main learning event there is, you've got a much better frame of mind and you're able to engage with the material much more actively. And you can engage in that higher order thinking much more easily as well. Now, that learning event may not actually be a lecture. It could just be a serious study session. So you might do this on a weekend and you know that, or maybe you do this on, let's say, a Wednesday, because you know that on the Saturday you're having a really, really big study session. So you could time it that way, where on that particular day, on the Wednesday, you just do this frame, so that on the Saturday, you're really ready to just dive into the material and start learning about it in much more depth. So let's assume that we've created a frame like this. It's a little bit more fleshed out. What are we going to do on the day when we're actually learning and we're actually studying all of that stuff? Well, we'll be going through, and we'll be going through all of our resources, our textbook. We'll be going through the video in itself, much more in depth and properly. And this is naturally a time-consuming process, but it's the same amount of time you would normally spend. You're still having to read things. You're still having to listening to things. You can't skip the step of consuming information. That information has to enter your brain somehow. We're saving time by making it so that when the information enters into your brain is able to use it more quickly in a more meaningful way that produces a higher level of memory and retention, so that it's not slipping away so quickly and then you have to spend more time to relearn it again and again and again. So we can't save that much time on the raw consuming of information other than listening to videos at double speed or learning to read more quickly. But again, even that, there's limited returns. You can save maybe 30 minutes, an hour or so for a single study session, which may seem like a lot, and it is decent. However, when you think about it in terms of weeks of studying, an hour a day of saving is actually not that much if you're considering that some of these skills will allow you to actually make entire days of studying completely unnecessary because you just didn't forget everything that you would normally spend that time to relearn, or that you needed to reach a higher level because you're able to reach that level much more quickly. So when we're going through this and we're thinking about all the new things that we could add on here. So for example, in this textbook, the report on learning, there's a lot of information here about cognitive load theory. So what can we do? As we're learning about cognitive load theory, we could start going into this. So let's say cognitive load theory is, I believe I put it under learning processes. So under learning processes, let's say that there is a chunk coming out here called cognitive load theory. And this is not necessarily exactly how it looked, but this is the gist of it. We'd be going through and any pertinent ideas about it, we could literally just add on to here. And for now, I'm happy for you to just write it down, simplify the words, add visuals in areas where you feel like you don't need to add words. I haven't added any visuals here so far at the moment because I haven't really felt the need to, because it's all felt very intuitive. However, if there is any point that I feel like I might forget this, or this is very wordy and I feel like this is not this is a very obtuse, unnecessary way of expressing this idea, then I wouldn't really go into all of those words. I would be just diving through and drawing some images and abstracting on it and using my visualizations for that instead. And you see that in the other examples that I give throughout the program. So I'm going to add whatever information. I'm going to try to keep it simple. I'm not going to make it too wordy. I'll use visualizations wherever I feel like I need that memory boost. And every now and again, I'm going to rearrange the map that I've created. I'm going to reorganize things. Even if you try your best, for most people, especially beginner and even intermediate level learners, you will end up with a map that looks very, very difficult to follow. There will be things going everywhere. It's going to be a mess. You'll create like a portal over here so that arrow can come through over here. You'll even if you put in all of your best effort, you will still end up with a very messy mind map. And that's normal as well. What you can do after that is to just clean that up. And that could actually even be a form of interleaved retrieval for you. You could do that at the end of the week, on a weekend. You could say, I'm going to take this map, I'm going to clean it up and really organize my thoughts and really think about whether I've grouped them in the best way. If it's messy, there's probably a better way to group it. And it's about you to, it's on you to figure out what that better way is. So for example, if I didn't split research and improvement into research and practice, I would have ended up with heaps of different things over here. And then I would have realized that all of these things are related to these things. So I would have had arrows going in this direction. And then I would have realized that that actually affects, for example, some of these skills. So that would have happened. And then that looks very, very messy. But now, because of the way that I've put it, I don't have to do that. I can represent it much more cleanly. I have the practice, and I could just simply say that that is related to all of this here, like that, for example. And that would just show that relationship. So you can see how much cleaner it can be with better grouping. So if it's ending up looking quite messy and hard to follow, even at a glance, that tells you that there is improvement that can be made with the way that you've grouped it, the way that you've spaced things out, and how you're thinking about the relationships. Common issues at this point are thinking about the relationships afterwards. So if you go through to learn about it in detail and you just think about putting it all on the map, and then you think about how it's related together and how you could group it, that's going to be very, very difficult to do, because that becomes information listed on the page and then arrows done retrospectively. What's really common to see is you'd often see these kind of big blocks of text all over the page, and you'll see arrows kind of dodging and weaving in and out of the material, almost dodging the blocks of text. What that says is that the arrows were thought about after it was put on paper, which is the opposite way that we want it to be. We actually want it to be that we thought about the relationships before we even committed it, because that is the correct order of higher order thinking, rather than just thinking about isolated information first and then trying to connect it afterwards. We have to think about how it's related, create a place for that information to belong, and then we can add that information and it becomes immediately more relevant. In that main learning event, the day after, during that, that bulk of the studying period, we're going through the textbook, we're going through the other documents and resources, we're going through the videos, we're consuming the information and we're adding it to the map, we're thinking about where it belongs, we're connecting it with a purpose, a bigger picture, we're grouping it, we're thinking about relationships at every single step of the way. And then afterwards, we can clean that up. A week or so later, we can clean it up even further, or we can use some other form of interleaved retrieval. So, for example, I may decide that I'm at a point where I feel like I can teach someone this. So I may teach an imaginary student. I may create my own practice questions that are very difficult and use an extended method there. I may use an existing question bank and then add on additional value through creating my own answer sheet from that. I could have specific methods of using study groups. I could incorporate elements of memorization, for example, the things that I just didn't know how to fit onto this map. I could put those onto my flashcards, and therefore I could just do those flashcards in a parallel stream whenever I've got time here and there in a true micro-learning fashion. So these are the other supplements that you would have. I'm not going to demonstrate that because it's relatively straightforward, and there are, just dozens of different methods of interleaving that are available for you that you can read through in the interleaving table. But if you're able to do this, and on the background of this, you're managing yourself well with good time and task management, you're prioritizing, you're using your practice blocks so that you can develop these skills. If you're finding it really difficult to do this, it means that you do need more practice. And that practice has to come from you scheduling and putting that time in. So that comes back to the self-management skills. So if we've got the right self-management skills, time management, task management, marginal gains, we're being quite reflective, we're looking at growth in terms of the mistakes we're making and figuring out what mistakes we're likely to make at an early stage with our practice blocks. And then we're actually practicing it consistently. We're doing our nonlinear note-taking. We're forming groups. We're thinking about relationships. We're mapping it out generally. We're spending a bit more time processing the information in our head instead of just putting it out there. We're using some visualizations to abstract it. And then we're applying good spaced interleaved retrieval. If we're using all of those things, then we're really halfway there on our journey. Issues start arising when just even one of those components is missing. This is a very complicated cake, and even one of those ingredients not being there means that the cake doesn't really rise. So it's important to check off all of those things. So take a moment to reflect on yourself in terms of how you would study this material or how you have studied this material. Think about the things that you could improve on before moving on to the next stages.